The main character's name is Zhen Fan, and up to this point, he was the author of a horror manhua. On the wall in the room, there were posters with characters from his manhua. There was a girl in traditional Chinese clothes with long black hair and purple eyes, and also a vampire with blonde hair and pointed long horns. Also on another poster, there was a huge, pumped-up man with a large axe. There was also a poster with a zombie guy wrapped in chains. The main character was doomed to a miserable death due to an incurable disease. Zhen Fan, with an oxygen tube in his nose, exhaled heavily. His hand lay on a book with a picture of the main character of his work. Zhen Fan explained that he was reborn into him. All of the above characters and more greeted the gentleman. Zhen Fan reflected that he had a good time in this world. He had something to eat and drink. He sat on a throne at a table on which, due to the abundance of food, there was no empty space. A girl with black hair poured a drink into his goblet, while the other characters ate greedily. Zhen Fan explained that he was surrounded by beauties. While he was taking a bath, one pressed her breasts against his hand and asked, addressing him as master, whether the water was warm enough. The aforementioned girl with black hair and violet eyes was lying in bed and seducing him with a request to spend the night with her maid. Zhen Fan continued to think that in this world, dangers lurk on all sides, and wherever he is, there will be those who wish for his death. Men who looked like barbarians rode swiftly on horses, shouting to kill everyone. Zhen Fan continued that there are enemies who will not miss the opportunity to strike a fatal blow. A girl with a golden diadem and purple hair brought a knife blade to Zhen Fan's throat with a wish for death, and he was very surprised by this behavior, opening his mouth wide. Zhen Fan explained that even his servants are only thirsty for his blood to regain their strength. The aforementioned muscular man said that then if the master dies, all of his other servants finished their sentence by saying that they would get their powers back. A vampire with blonde hair and blue eyes asked what they were waiting for. He rushed towards Zhen Fan. The zombie supported this idea, shouting to his allies to attack. Another servant with pointed ears, purple hair and green eyes said loudly that we must attack together. He smiled widely. Another servant with green hair, a small gem in his forehead, and a black blindfold asked his master for forgiveness for all the servants. His face was indifferent, and he himself began to use magic. Zhen Fan continued the idea that even the creation of his hands, his brainchild, also longs to kill its parent. A huge monster, looking like a baby giant, with spikes from its head, looked at Zhen Fan with an ominous smile and invited Daddy to play. Zhen Fan looked in his direction, nervous. He realized that in order to survive, he only had to harden his heart. He swung his sword over the head of one of the demons and cut off the head with rage in his eyes. He realized that he needed to fill his heart with evil. Zhen Fan touched the beaten man's cheek, asking how he dared to raise his sword at him. The man lowered his eyes, regretting what he had done, and Zhen Fan said with a gloomy look and a slight smile that his people would kill this man's entire family. He completed his thought that he had become the legendary demon king after all. His Majesty Lucifer returned to the beginning of the story. A house owned by Zhen Fan, who was a Manhua studio called Demonic Pill. A loud cough was heard in the room belonging to Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan said that he was glad to welcome everyone. He apologized for gathering everyone here today. He also apologized that from the very beginning he did not listen to those he was addressing. And if he had listened to them, they would not have had to break up, and their studio would still exist. He did not finish this thought and said that now they only had to say goodbye to the readers. His voice came from the phone of one of the studio employees. This and 3 other employees stood in the middle of the main studio room with posters and watched the video that Zhen Fan left for them after his death. He was sitting at his desk in the video and kept saying that he was really glad that he was able to create so many stories and characters with all of them. He wished them good luck in everything and health, and then added that he would miss them. Zhen Fan thought that he had been writing about death for so many years, and now she herself was knocking on his door, and through him death would come to them. He turned to his works, placing his right hand on them, and then he thought about the feeling of death. He decided that this was not so bad, and then he thought that this was such a pleasant feeling. He denied his thoughts, not understanding what was happening. Zhen Fan was reborn as the protagonist of his works. He was very surprised that his consciousness was clearing up. He was lying on the bed, and the maid was wiping his face with a damp towel. Zhen Fan opened his eyes and asked where he was. The maid dropped a basin of water and, frightened by his statement, fell to the floor. He asked who she was and why he was here. The maid was very surprised, and then she screamed and began to run away shouting that he had woken up. Zhen Fan, a little sweaty, sat up on the bed. He frowned and asked himself, "Isn't he dead?" He added, "Has he been reborn?" Zhen Fan looked to the side. He noticed clothes hanging nearby. He put it on and, exhaling heavily, thought about how this body is so weak that he can barely keep these clothes on himself. And, unlike his previous sick body, this one is at least capable of recovery. The sound of a door opening was heard. A girl with black hair and a blue robe loudly called him master. Zhen Fan was very surprised, mentally asking how is this possible. Was it really Feng Xingyan? She threw herself into his arms and said that he had finally woken up. She added that his submissive slave had been waiting for him for 6 months. Zhen Fan was very surprised by her trick and blushed. He wondered if she was the heroine of his work. But where is she here from? She pressed her chest against him, and he took her hands and moved her away from him, breathing a little heavily and sweating. Feng Xunjian immediately apologized loudly and said that his slave had violated etiquette. She looked slightly worried. She got down on one knee and bowed to him, saying that she had not shown restraint. Feng Xingyang apologized to him, addressing him as master. She added that as soon as the maid reported that Zhen Fan had woken up, Feng Xingyang couldn't believe her ears. Zhen Fan was very surprised and, blushing, mentally asked why she calls him master. There was an awkward silence. Feng Xunjian rose from her knees and, walking up to him, took his arm. She again addressed him as a master and asked him to come with her, because they would all also be happy when they found out that he had woken up. Zhen Fan, a little confused, asked who she was talking about. Meanwhile, they went outside, and Feng Xunjian explained that this is the courtyard of the guest house, and they are all here. Feng Xinyan noticed through the open door in the room how someone was pouring red liquid into a glass, and then she shouted to him, calling him Ammon, that the gentleman had woken up. She loudly repeated that the gentleman had indeed woken up. Zhen Fan turned his head towards the blonde vampire with great surprise. He couldn't believe his ears, mentally repeating, Ammon. He wondered if this was the real vampire Ammon. Feng Xingyang firmly took Zhen Fan's arm, frowned a little, and shouted that this was impudence and how dare Ammon not show respect to the master. Ammon, irritated, tusked and went out into the street, placing his right hand on his chest and wishing the gentleman long life. Feng Xinyan asked Zhen Fan not to pay attention to Ammon, and then she added that this idiot had a bad temper, and then suggested that we go to the others. Ammon followed them. Zhen Fan thought that Feng Xinyan and Ammon are all heroes of his work, which means that, before he could finish his thought, they noticed a small gnome with purple hair sitting on the shoulder of a muscular woodcutter. The dwarf's name was Zhu San, and the woodcutter's name was Fan Lai. Zhu San, with a wide smile, was very surprised at the appearance of the gentleman and loudly declared that he had finally woken up and wished him health. Fan Lai simply smiled. Zhen Fan thought that he did not come to this world alone. Someone approached them and said that the courtyard was quite lively and that it looked like lunch would be served early. It was a blind demon with long hair and a jewel in his forehead, whose name was Blind Bay. Walking with him was a zombie in a black robe and mask. His name was Liang Cheng. Zhen Fan thought that after all, the heroes of his work were keeping him company. Greatly surprised, he looked at everyone present and finished the thought that they were all demon kings. It was a clear sunny day. Zhen Fan mentally summed up that he was Zhen Fan, and until recently he was the author of a horror manhua, and who could imagine that after death from an incurable disease, he would continue to live in the world where he ended up with the heroes of his works. They all sat at the table and ate. Zhen Fan noticed that Feng Xinyan stood up. She made a toast congratulating the gentleman on his return. She added that from now on they have someone to follow. All those present each raised their containers of alcohol and drank, supporting her toast. Zhen Fan raised his palm to his face and thought about the fact that she called him master again. And that word follow was said again. Are they really playing out their roles? He asked them all if he understood them correctly, that they descended into the world 6 months ago, and all this time they were all here just making money for a living. Everyone present was greatly surprised by his words. The blind man's hand trembled, and he turned to the master, saying that from the day they came into this world, not only Zhen Fan was in oblivion, but they all also became ordinary people. Zhen Fan asked loudly, "What?" With a worried look. He thought that who would have thought that those same demon kings from the Manhua, who could create a real bloody mess in an instant, would suddenly become ordinary people? Zhen Fan continued to think that it is not surprising that they had to spend so much time in this guest compound. Only then, even though for some reason they call him master, he is absolutely not ready to lead the demon kings in their full greatness. He turned to Feng Xingyang and asked where was the demonic pill. Feng Xingyang stood up and asked the master to wait a little, and Zhen Fan at this time thought that although Feng Xingyang and the blind man came out of his imagination, the demonic pill, a character completely invented by him from beginning to end, also helped him with them. He remembered the image of a demonic baby whose skeleton was visible and had spikes on its head. Zhen Fan thought with a serious look that if he was here too, he would simply be overjoyed. Feng Xinyan brought a small box, telling the master that the demonic pill was here. He was very surprised, and Feng Xinyan put the box on the table and opened it. There was a small stone. Feng Xunjian explained that since the demonic pill did not have a physical shell, he did not need to eat or drink, so he sealed himself in this stone. Some time later, Zhen Fan lay in the gazebo in the courtyard and held the demonic pill in his hands, looking at him. Zhen Fan said that it was okay before, but now he has awakened. So why is the demonic pill still sleeping, and isn't he ashamed? Demonic pill, being a stone, did not respond. Zhen Fan sat down and continued to say that there is nothing surprising in this, and it's not for them to crawl at the feet of a common man. It's enough that Feng Xinyan and Zhu San pretend to be servants for Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan placed the demonic pill on the pad and heard a loud knock. Someone ordered that Feng Xingyang be allowed to bandage his hand. Ammon replied that it was not worth it, because he was a vampire. His glass broke and Ammon injured his hand. Fanlai said that they don't have their strength, so he thinks it would be better to bandage it. Ammon said that it doesn't matter to him, and he will regain his power faster than all of them, and it will take him 3 days, no more. Fanlai calmly replied that then he would take the wine to the living room first. After he left, Zhen Fan asked if he was distracting Ammon. Ammon was cleaning up the fragments and was a little surprised when he heard the gentleman's voice. Zhen Fan offered to talk. Ammon turned to him, and they went out into the courtyard. There was a table and 2 chairs in the courtyard, and Zhen Fan sat on one of them. He asked if Ammon would sit down. He, standing nearby, replied that the chair was dirty. Zhen Fan, accepting his answer, asked what kind of place this was. Ammon replied that he did not know. Zhen Fan asked again that they had been here for half a year, but Ammon never found out. He replied that he was only interested in winemaking. Zhen Fan asked, who could know then? Ammon suggested that the blind man might know, because he sits at the gate all day. Zhen Fan, scratching the back of his head, said that something didn't add up. After all, they ended up in another world and didn't even try to collect information about it. He added that all players know that the most important thing at the beginning is to scout the area, especially when it comes to Rebirth, right? Ammon said with a gloomy look that this was all unnecessary, because Zhen Fan was unconscious anyway. Zhen Fan became a little nervous, mentally asking what kind of logic this is, and does Ammon really want to blame everything on him? Ammon, with a calm face, told the gentleman that he should not be afraid of them. Zhen Fan was a little nervous and asked again, should he be afraid? Ammon explained, getting down on one knee, that, to tell the truth, they despise him. They despise him greatly, but they will not leave him. They did not leave him while he was in oblivion, and now that he has woken up, they will not leave him any more abandoned. Ammon bowed his head and placed his right hand on his chest, bowing. Zhen Fan asked with slight bewilderment that they wouldn't leave him. Zhen Fan wondered if Ammon really decided to punch his feelings, and it would be okay if Feng Xinyan and Zhu San said this, but it's very unusual to hear such a thing from the ancestor of vampires, and maybe they mixed up their lines. Ammon, raising his head, explained that other studio workers abandoned them, but Zhen Fan not only did not abandon them, but also continued their stories, so they would not leave him. Ammon rose from his knee and, leaving, said that while the master was in oblivion, They only had to wait until this day. He added that the blind man knows more about this world, and the master should still ask him questions. Ammon left, and Zhen Fan muttered with a gloomy look that they despise him, but still do not leave him. He mentally added that they don't seem to know that they are the heroes of his work, so they recognize him as their master. Zhen Fan looked up at the sky with a slight smile and quietly said, "Thank you." When Ammon left, he was greatly surprised by the realization that his hand had healed instantly. Sometime later, in a room where there was a stage and many seats for spectators, Zhu-san spoke on stage, talking about how last time he focused on how Brother Huo became the strongest warrior by rushing into battle on his war donkey. Zhu-san spoke with a smile and enthusiasm about how her brother clashed with the enemy with 3,000 blows, and the battlefield extended to hundreds. Before he could finish speaking, one of the spectators laughed and shouted, "The strongest warrior!" He imitated Zhu-san and asked him if this warrior's donkey runs fast. At the end of the auditorium sat Zhen Fan. He mentally asked the question, has Zhu-san, who loves to cut people off piece by piece, really become a simple storyteller? Zhen Fan propped his head on his hand and looked at Zhu-san with disappointment, continuing to think that if the readers found out about this, it's scary to even imagine what would happen to Zhen Fan. He noticed a man talking with a beautiful half-naked girl. Zhen Fan thought that in his work, in all eras, in all cities, and in all worlds, Feng Xingyang opened brothels, and it seems that this one is the most neglected of all. Zhen Fan lowered his head, looking at the floor, and muttered quietly, "Is this world really ordinary?" He went outside where the blind man was sitting and smoking bamboo. He said that in this world, the strength of the local government is weak, but it seems like a rather ordinary world. He added that everyone he met during these 6 months were ordinary people. A man rode past them on the street on a green feathered horse. Zhen Fan pointed his finger at the horse and, with a slight frown, said, "Look at that horse." And then he asked if there were such people in the ordinary world. The blind man answered with a slight smile that he was blind. Evening came. Feng Xunjian told the gentleman that everything was ready. Zhen Fan, looking at the demonic pill in his hands, said that he had already learned the blind man's opinion about this world, and asked the demon kings what they thought about this opinion. Feng Xungyang said to the master with a slight smile that it doesn't matter what they think, and they just want to know what the master's next move will be. Feng Xunjian continued speaking, pointing to this building. She said that when they opened this inn, they agreed that when the master woke up, he would personally choose the name. She suggested 2 options, Inn of Goodness or Inn of Dragon Gate, and then she asked what His Majesty thought. Zhen Fan asked with a serious face, "Should I sit and wait for death or take fate into my own hands?" He looked at all the demon kings and asked again, "Have they all gone through death here? Is there anything else I need to think about?" He explained that the second option would be better. Feng Xunjian asked the gentleman with concern, "Maybe he will think again," to which he replied, "What?" Zhen Fan said that in the past, he loved everything scary because it inspired him. For example, scary clowns, dark magic, horror films. And what a pity that only through drawing he was able to experience this atmosphere for himself. He thought that in this world, except for his characters, he had nothing. For him, living in this world every day was in itself a huge acquisition, and therefore, instead of choosing a calm and measured life, it would be better for him to rush towards adventure. Zhen Fan stated, putting the demonic pill on the stand, that if he loses this game and the game is over, but since he decides his future fate, he will choose something that he will not regret in the future. The blind man replied that he understood everything, and ordered Zhu-san to go to the field office as soon as possible. Then he ordered Fan Liu to find the caravan and infiltrate it, and also find out if there was any suitable place for them. They both accepted the order with enthusiasm. The blind man said that the daughter of the chief of the city guard was suffering from infertility. When she was here, the blind man saw her fate, and in the evening he sent her hex water. And as for the inn, Zhen Fan together with Feng Xingyang welcomed the guest. Feng Xingyang smiled and nodded, while Zhen Fan watched the blind man a little surprised. The blind man ordered Liang Cheng to help Feng Xingyang along with Ammon and make sure everything went smoothly. The blind man added that Feng Xingyang should serve a juicy piece of meat to the table, but let her remember that the first bite should go to the master. She tucked her hair behind her ear and agreed, saying that today she would personally receive guests, and whoever paid the most would get it. She went to run errands, and the blind man looked after her. Zhen Fan was a little tense. He thought that although it really seems that in these 6 months the guys had become more submissive, but still this is not their true character. They were only waiting for him to wake up, waiting his order, and finally, before his awakening, everything they did was only false. Feng Xunjian walked past Ammon along the corridor and asked did he not have dinner today because the blood was not good enough. Ammon drew attention to her and clenched his hand into a fist, answering positively and saying that the blood was simply disgusting. That night, Zhen Fan talked to Ammon. Zhen Fan said that Fan Lai went to the desert with a caravan. Zhu San handed over the materials to the county government. The blind man went to the head of the city guard, but never returned. Ammon said that he understood him, to which Zhen Fan asked if he could help with anything. Ammon replied that in fact the gentleman had already helped them a lot. Zhen Fan was irritated by these words, thinking that he is only helping by not getting in the way. Ammon, putting his nails in order, said that the auction was already over, but there was a small problem. They paid too high a price. One of the people on the street asked who these people from the inn were. He added that each of them is painted like some kind of demon. The man standing next to him told the young master that, according to rumors, this is their specialty. Ammon explained that their guest must be the son of the head of some influential clan. He will have an escort with him, although he looks more like a guard, and, as they say, over the past couple of days he has created a big mess in the city. But no one has I didn't dare to rein him in. But even if so, there's no need to worry. While Ammon was speaking, Zhen Fan was thinking that this son of the head of some influential clan had placed the highest bid. This means that the more money and the higher the status in society, the greater his real influence. Zhen Fan noticed that Feng Xingyang should not miss such a big fish. Ammon continued to say that the stronger his guard, the more valuable the spoils. One way or another, Feng Xingyang has already received the money, and she does not need to sleep with him for real. But if the master really wants to help somehow. Sometime later, in the corridor, Liang Cheng, crossing his arms over his chest, saw Zhen Fan walking along this corridor and carrying a keg of wine. Liang Cheng asked who made the gentleman come here. Mine? Zhen Fan replied that this was his desire. He explained that since he broke the jug, he brought it, no problem. Zhen Fan frowned a little, raising the barrel of wine a little higher, and thought that not only Ammon said he, but also Liang Cheng considers him a burden. Liang Cheng told the master to do as he sees fit, but not to overdo it. He began to walk up the stairs, saying that after all, they couldn't sacrifice their master's safety. Zhen Fan mentally asked with slight surprise, does Liang Cheng really care about him? Meanwhile, their guest arrived, calling Feng Xunjiang a beauty. He added that he was burning with impatience, and he had something for her. Meanwhile, Ammon was processing his nails with a sharp blade. Then he looked at his hand, which had a wound on it not so long ago. But now the hand was completely healed, swung with a wide smile and pierced his hand with this blade. Pulling out the blade, he saw that the blood on his palm was disappearing, and, smiling broadly, licked it. Meanwhile, Feng Xunjian was sitting on the bed. She was beautifully made up and dressed. She asked the guest if he liked the way she looked. The guest immediately blushed deeply, looking at her, and rattled off that he really liked it. He added, looking closely at her legs, along which she ran her palm, that he had never seen anything more beautiful. Feng Xunjian, smiling calmly, said that she has a lot of stockings. Their guest looked at her hungrily, drooling and breathing heavily. He stretched out his hands to her. Feng Xunjian lay down on the bed and seductively said that if he likes it. She stood up and began to approach him. She said that if he likes it, she can try anything on for him. Feng Xunjian hugged him by the shoulders, smiled, and, approaching his ear, called him master, syllable by syllable. Afterwards, she began to try on different stockings, asking if he liked it, and he was completely attentive and blushed from each new look. This gentleman's guard stood near the door and guarded the room in which Feng Xingyang and his master were. The guard asked intimidatingly, "What are the new arrivals doing here?" It was Zhen Fan and Liang Cheng who came. Liang Cheng said that by order of the owner, they brought wine, the best of the best. The guard lowered his head and said that he did not drink. Liang Cheng objected, saying that he had misunderstood, and this was on the orders of their master. The guard looked at Zhen Fan with suspicion, and Zhen Fan, not understanding the guard's contemptuous look, remained silent. The guard told him to come through, and Zhen Fan agreed as he walked inside. The guard watched him closely, and he felt a little uneasy. The guest demanded that Feng Xingyang take off her stockings. Feng Xunjian asked why there was such a hurry, and, taking one stocking, wrapped it around the guest's neck, and then pulled him towards her. In an instant, she attacked the guest, and Zhen Fan attacked the guard, smashing a pot of wine over his head and blinding him. Feng Xunjian pulled the guest's throat so that he could not breathe. Ammon burst in through the window. He grabbed a sharp hairpin belonging to Feng Xingyang and stuck it in the guest's throat. He fell to the floor and bled. Feng Xunjian, sweating and breathing heavily, asked, "Is he not dead?" Ammon said that he didn't seem to be very much. He was interrupted by a loud sound from the corridor. The guard was angry at such antics of the owners of the house and wanted to attack Zhen Fan. He was a little scared, but Liang Cheng came to his aid. He was catching up with the guard, but the guard turned around and attacked him. Zhen Fan was very worried about Liang Cheng, but he took out his weapon and stuck a stake in the guard's back, and he began to bleed. The guard asked whether Liang Cheng was a daredevil. Liang Cheng did not understand his statement. Moments later, Liang Cheng and Zhen Fan were thrown away by the blast wave from the guard who was emitting blue light. Zhen Fan did not understand this was internal or martial energy. He was worried about what was happening and, frowning, thought that this time they had caught a really big fish, but this fish didn't really want to be eaten. The guard was in a fighting stance, and then looked at the door to the room where his master was. The guard ran into the room shouting, "Is his master okay?" He tried to open his eyes slightly, and immediately saw Ammon rushing to attack. The guard took a defensive stance, ready to counterattack. Zhen Fan shouted Ammon, "Be careful!" But it was too late, because when Ammon was already 1 meter from the guard, he pierced him with his blade and pressed him to the wall. The guard demanded an explanation. Who sent them? He pushed the blade deeper into Ammon's stomach. Screaming, the guard asked who they really were. Ammon began to laugh. First quietly, then louder, his face became crazy. Zhen Fan watched this and was very surprised that Ammon instantly grew large fangs and bit the guard. The guard, shocked by the pain, screamed loudly. When Ammon had drunk enough blood and released him, the exhausted guard fell to the floor, unconscious. Ammon smiled widely, wiping his lips with his palm, and said, "What a familiar feeling," or 2 pairs of large wings. Feng Xingyan, Liang Cheng, and Zhen Fan were very surprised by this. They all didn't understand how Ammon got his powers back. Meanwhile, Ammon hid his wings, and the other demon kings present mentally asked if they could do it too. Ammon smiled and licked the blood from his fingers. Tisking, Feng Xingyan came up to him and said how convenient it is for them, vampires. He bit and restored his strength, and quenched his thirst. She asked when Ammon managed to regain this ability. He calmly replied that it happened yesterday. Feng Xunjian frowned and crossed her arms over her chest, asking how did he do it? Ammon still calmly answered that it happened because of the Master's awakening. Feng Xunjian immediately smiled and her eyes shone greedily. She mentally asked again, turning to Zhen Fan, who with incomprehension noticed her gaze due to the awakening of the Master. She looked at him with a smile and began to move towards him with the thought that then her strength would too. Zhen Fan tensed and, addressing her by name, asked what was wrong with her. She bowed obediently to him and told the gentleman that the fish had been caught, and then she invited him to accompany him to the bedroom and leave everything else to her. Meanwhile, Liang Cheng stood in the warehouse near the coffin in which Ammon lay. Liang Cheng asked maybe the secret to Ammon's recovery is that he sleeps in a coffin. Ammon replied that traditions must be respected, and doesn't Liang Cheng, like a zombie, understand this? Liang Cheng responded in the negative and said that he preferred the bed. Ammon, crossing his arms over his chest and closing his eyes, said that before he had slept little in a coffin, after entering this world he spent a lot of money to order this coffin. He added that Liang Cheng is mortal, and only when they grow old do they realize their mortality. Liang Cheng, crossing his arms over his chest, said that Ammon was now a mortal himself. Somewhere nearby a voice said, "What do you mean an accident almost happened?" Liang Cheng looked in that direction and saw the blind man standing and peeling a tangerine. The blind man said it was his fault. Ammon said that this is so, but in any case, for some reason it seems to him that only such a world could inspire them. The blind man said that after today's success this world had opened up a little to them, and after that he asked them to continue the conversation, and he himself said that he would return to interrogating their dear guest. Ammon made a proposal in a loud voice that the gentleman personally interrogate him. The blind man and Liang Cheng were very surprised by his words. The blind man said that in his opinion, the gentleman could not cope with this yet, and let him take care of it himself for the time being. Ammon added that it would be better to speed up this process slightly. The blind man asked if this was the reason for Ammon's restoration. He added a little irritably, starting to leave, that they had agreed to stay apart. But Ammon began to act without permission. Liang Cheng remained silent, thinking for a while, and then calmly asked Ammon, what did they do with the gentleman alone? Ammon replied that it sounded a little strange. Liang Cheng continued to ask if they did anything strange. Ammon said they communicated. Liang Cheng did not accept this answer, saying that they were all communicating. Ammon frowned and said that Zhen Fan was insignificant. Liang Cheng poked Ammon on the cheek and agreed with him. Ammon added that despite this, they will not leave him. Liang Cheng agreed with this too. Ammon exhaled heavily and, looking straight ahead, said that perhaps the only thing that was different between him and the other demon kings was that Ammon told the master that they would not leave him. Ammon suggested that the restoration of their strength was somehow connected with his trust in them, but so far this is not certain. Since they entered this world with their hearts, they recognized him as their master, but from the moment he woke up, it was like a certain the pact within them has become valid, and all they need now is to receive its recognition. Liang Cheng said that he was going to see Zhen Fan. Ammon said with irritation that the gentleman is now taking a bath, and does Liang Cheng really want to rub his back? Liang Cheng replied that he would wait until Zhen Fan finished. Ammon asked, is he really that impatient? In response, he heard that it was easy for him to speak, because he had already recovered. Ammon asked first to help him close the coffin, because he was going to bed. Liang Kem refused and left. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan sat in a huge wooden bathtub filled with hot water, and thought that who would have thought that this would be the first time they would kill a person, that this would be the first time he would see something like this in person, and not have a single drop of guilt in his soul. From behind the door, one of the demon kings turned to the master, saying that he needed to personally interrogate the prisoner. Zhen Fan ordered them to go on their own and then report the results to him. The blind man, putting his right hand on his chest and smiling, said that as soon as they receive any information, they will immediately notify him. Zhu San stood next to him and shouted to the master not to worry. After all, this guy doesn't look like Die Hard, and if he's stupid, there's one interesting interrogation method. Zhen Fan, recalling the events of today, thought that this world no longer cares whether a person is moral or not, whether he is righteous or not, but Zhen Fan believes that the main thing is that with all his aspirations, all his motives and all his actions, King's demons were devoted to him. Zhen Fan frowned thinking about this, and then took a wet towel and put it on his face, mentally asking himself, maybe it's just him who is like that. 3 hours later, Zhen Fan finished his bath and got dressed. He said that he had fallen asleep without noticing, and the most obvious change since he arrived in this world was that he slept better. Liang Cheng, being right behind him, pronounced the word master in frightening syllables. Zhen Fan tensed, and then jumped back and, angry, swore at Liang Cheng and asked if the interrogation was over. Zhen Fan thought that he almost had a stroke, but one way or another, Liang Cheng is a real zombie. Liang Cheng responded positively. Zhen Fan asked him about the injury. In response, he heard that it was just a scratch. Zhen Fan asked if Liang Cheng wanted to wash up and if he needed a bath. Liang Cheng responded in the negative. And then Zhen Fan finally asked what he needed. Liang Cheng was silent, and Zhen Fan exhaled heavily and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that if there is something that Liang Cheng wants to say, then he could safely speak, although Zhen Fan himself knows that he is not capable of anything, but he can still listen. Liang Cheng looked at the hand lying on his shoulder, and then sharply grabbed Zhen Fan's shoulder and intimidatingly asked him not to go with them next time. Zhen Fan frowned and mentally asked the question, why did Liang Cheng start being so frank at night? He said that he trusted the Demon Kings, and then he added a little nervously that he would go find out the results of the interrogation, and asked Liang Cheng to take care of himself. Zhen Fan turned around and walked out of the bath, and Liang Cheng stood with a trembling hand extended forward, with which he held Zhen Fan's shoulder. He drooped and sank to the floor, pitifully saying how ashamed he was. He covered his face with his palms. Suddenly he noticed that he was being attacked. It was Sunny. Zhen Fan and the blind man were sitting outside at a table and eating. The blind man told the master that this world is different from their world, and he can say that this world is much more interesting. Zhen Fan, taking the food with chopsticks, indifferently asked the blind man to get closer to the point. The blind man, using sticks and sauce, drew hieroglyphs on the table and asked the gentleman not to pay attention to his chatter. He would speak slowly, from point to point, but to the point. The blind man continued to say that the place where they are now is called Huchuo City, and this city includes a large area. The city belongs to Beifeng County, Yan Kingdom, which is almost like a province. In addition to Beifeng County, there are 6 more counties in the Yan Kingdom, and the capital is located in Tiancheng County. The blind man drew another line on the table. He added that Beifeng County was the northern border of the Kingdom of Yan, where 100 years ago the kingdom's warriors fought with robbers. Over the past 100 years, there has been no war between both sides, numbering more than 10,000 people. On the one hand, this is because the bandits are divided and cannot unite, and on the other hand, because of the southern Yan. In addition, the 3 kingdoms of Cayenne, Chu and Jin grinned like tigers looking for their prey, and Yan had to shift his attention to the Central Plains. With the exception of small vassal countries, this world is currently under the control of Yan, Jin, Chu, and Cayenne. The blind man finished drawing hieroglyphs. Zhen Fan asked with a slightly surprised look, there are only 4 kingdoms? The blind man replied that there is something else interesting. In this world, there are monks, magic, Kai and martial arts masters. All of them are rated on a 9-point scale, where 9 is the lowest indicator, and 1 is the highest indicator, and the guard whom the gentleman killed yesterday does not even fall into this scale. The blind man took the bowl with the snack and used chopsticks to take a piece. Zhen Fan smiled as he put a piece of food in his mouth and thought that although such things are often written about, after personal experience he was still shocked, and now he feels truly excited. Blind Bei, putting more food on his plate, told the master that now they were faced with the task of finding a way back. Zhen Fan replied that this could be ignored for now, and with a gloomy look asked to tell in more detail what Blind Bei was planning to do. Blind Bei smiled and began to say that the first thing they need to do is build up their forces in Huchuo City as a core, and then Blind Bei told his whole plan and asked the gentleman to correct him if something was wrong. Meanwhile, the food on the table was gone. Zhen Fan crossed his arms and said that he had nothing to add and praised Blind Bei for a job well done in planning. Blind Bei said that the gentleman is indeed wise. Zhen Fan, watching him bow, thought that Blind Bei was flattering him too much. Clearing his throat into his fist, he added that if he could help with anything, then let Blind Bei tell him about it right away. And even though he didn't have time to finish, Blind Bei said loudly that a subordinate only needs the master's trust. Zhen Fan twisted his face and said that he trusted him. Blind Bei objected that this was not so. Zhen Fan said that the truth is very trusting. Blind Bei objected that this was not so. Zhen Fan said that he is smart and that is why he trusts him. Blind Bei said decisively, no. Zhen Fan said that he is not lying and really trusts. Blind Bei replied that this is not the case at the moment. Zhen Fan has already nervously objected that he trusts him very much. Blind Bei said to himself with a smile that the subordinate thanks the master for his trust. While he was saying these words, he managed to magically transfer a piece of food from someone else's plate to his own. Zhen Fan was very surprised. He wondered if he should keep his distance from Blind Bei. Blind Bei, smiling and wiping his lips with a small towel, emitted streams of blue magic and thought that this would be the end of their meal. After lunch, Zhen Fan was walking along the courtyard of their inn and heard loud sounds coming from inside. He decided to check what was happening there, and, entering one of the rooms, he saw Zhu-san building something like a model of the local territory. Zhen Fan turned to him and asked, "Is this a topographic map?" Zhu-san turned to the gentleman with a smile and explained that the gentleman had a sharp eye. Zhu-san added with a bright smile that Blind Bay told him to make this topographic map, so now he is sketching for the next age. It is important for them to firmly establish themselves in Huchuo City and build a strategic topographic map for convenience. Zhen Fan smiled a little when he looked at the results of Zhu-san's labors, and then picked up the hammer and handed it to him. Zhu-san continued to make a topographic map, and Zhen Fan, smiling, put his hand on his shoulder and told him to continue working, and he himself would go and look at other places. The smile disappeared from Zhu-san's face for a second, and he was surprised by the master's touch. After a little hesitation, he began to work again, but almost immediately began to cough. The cough was strong, and Zhu-san began to slowly fall on his back, but managed to catch his body, standing on only one index finger of his hand. He was very surprised and smiled at the return of his strength, but for a second his smile became very scary. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan walked through the courtyard again, thinking that since yesterday, Feng Xingyang, Liang Cheng, and Blind Bay were acting strangely, but Zhu Sen remained the same as usual. However, it still seems that Zhen Fan will be able to get along with them. He wanted to go into the next room, but he heard a very loud laugh and turned around. He asked if this laugh belonged to Zhu San, and then he tripped over the threshold of the room and began to fall forward. With a surprised face, he fell on Feng Xunjian's chest, and she, with a calm look, asked if the master was okay. Zhen Fan blushed deeply and immediately stood up, stammering. He asked what Feng Xingyan was doing here. She, also blushing a little, said that she had brought his clothes. When Zhen Fan changed his clothes, she explained that over the past 6 months she had sewn several sets of clothes for him and added that he had not yet fully recovered, but nevertheless, it suited him very well. Zhen Fan was dressed in very expensive clothes with gold accents and precious stones. It was a dark blue robe with red elements that resembled the clothes of a general. Zhen Fan smiled and quietly said that he grew up without parents, so no one had sewn new clothes for him for a long time. Feng Xunjian took his hand with both hands and told the master that if it was his will, she could act out the role of his mother. Feng Xunjian blushed deeply and pressed his hand to her chest. Zhen Fan addressed her by name. She interrupted him, saying that whatever he wanted, she would be willing to cooperate, and she was good at role-playing games. Zhen Fan immediately moved away from her and thought with a blank face that there was no doubt that compared to these demons, he was too pure. Blind Bay entered the room, and a teapot immediately flew at his head. He dodged, and Feng Xunjian loudly called him angrily and asked if he had been taught to knock. She bit the towel irritably and thought that they had such a good atmosphere, and Blind Bay took it and ruined everything. Zhen Fan stood with an indifferent face. Blind Bay cleared his throat and knocked on the open door, and then with a smile announced that something had happened at the entrance to the inn. A stately man in metal armor. He informed them that their army would soon go to war, so the emperor ordered the hiring of workers who could transport army supplies for 1,000 troops. In a commanding tone, the man added that from now on they are the Zhang family, and all family members will go there. This man slowly took out his katana from its sheath and ordered them to hurry up and said that he would not accept any excuses, and they should not even think of delaying the affairs of the army. He asked them to remember that his sword had taken countless lives. The man was hostile. In response to his words, Feng Xingyan quietly called him by name and rank, Officer Zhu, and said that Fan Lai had run away with the merchants, Ammon was sick, and what if he infected everyone in the barracks with tuberculosis? Her gaze was terrifying. Officer Zhu thought for a moment and loudly shouted to forget about these two, and the rest will be hired for this job. Gosha stood up and sheathed his sword. As he was leaving, he shouted loudly that by tomorrow noon they should be at the barracks outside the city. He added that this was an order, and asked if they had heard him. Feng Xunjian waved her hand at him with a smile, responded positively, and wished him a good journey. Gosha and his guards went home, and Zhen Fan with a gloomy face thought that this time they really had big problems. Blind Bay came into the room and said that now they have 2 ways. The first is to collect their things and leave Huchuo today. But before he could finish, Zhen Fan said with a serious look that they would continue. Feng Xingyan, Liang Cheng, and Blind Bei were pleased with his determination. Zhen Fan, sitting down on a chair, said that they had been working on the inn and their current identities for almost a whole year. In addition to this, Huchuo City is the first point of their plan. It would be ugly if they gave up so easily. He rubbed his head with his hand with a thoughtful look and added that, moreover, it was extremely unrealistic to start a rebellion over such a trifle. Blind Bei smiled and told the master that he was very far-sighted, and then turned to Zhu-san and said that he would go with them, and asked if he could help them. Zhu-san answered positively with a smile. Feng Xingyan, a little offended, asked with her palm on her chest, why can't she go? After all, she could serve them. Blind Bei asked if she was going to role-play as a military prostitute. She averted her eyes in test, to which Blind Bei replied that they were the master's subordinates, and their duties were to remove obstacles in his path. Zhu-san jumped up cheerfully and asked the gentleman to leave everything to him. Zhen Fan sat on the chair with a smirk and thought that based on the emperor's character, he didn't think he would want them to perceive him as Liu Chan. Zhen Fan realized that he was ahead of them in all respects. Early the next morning, Zhen Fan and Liang Cheng arrived at the tented military camp. Zhen Fan said that they were told to follow along with the army. Is it really that bad this time? He thought about who would have thought that he would be reborn in another world and have to go to war. Liang Cheng turned to him and said that they had problems. Zhen Fan turned around and asked what happened. Liang Cheng said that according to the order, they were only responsible for transporting food and supplies, and the army was supposed to be in front, but he could not find any sign that the army had passed through here. The purpose of the attack, the size of the army, the blitzkrieg, the protracted war, none of this is known to them, and they are thrown onto the battlefield immediately after their arrival. Something is definitely wrong here. Zhen Fan remained silent and thought deeply. His thoughts were interrupted by Zhu San suddenly appearing. He said with a worried look that he had found something. Zhen Fan asked, "What?" Zhu San held a handful of stones in his hand and said that he was just at the ration cart and found this. He opened his palm wide and said with incomprehension that this cart was filled with stones. 2 days later, Liang Cheng told the gentleman that something would most likely happen today. Zhen Fan asked what he saw. Liang Cheng asked what Zhen Fan thought about the current location of the barracks. Liang Cheng stood opposite Zhen Fan, who was sitting on the floor with his legs crossed and his head propped up on his hand. Zhen Fan said that, firstly, there is a guaranteed source of water here, which the enemy cannot cut off in any way. Meanwhile, Zhu San sat and cooked food in a pot over a fire. Zhen Fan continued to say with a serious face that secondly, given the fact that their camp is located in a canyon, they can better ensure their defense by lowering the defensive zone. Liang Cheng bowed to him and said that he was very wise. Zhen Fan frowned and thought that this was blatant flattery, and it seemed as if they did not ask for money for this work. Although, given their daily routine, it must not be that simple. Liang Cheng said that the master did not take into account one point. All of this would be applicable if they had the main combat power, and they have less than 200 cavalrymen, and most of them are ordinary people who were dragged here by force. Frowning, he added that if several hundred cavalrymen attacked them from one side, and other units launched a surprise attack from the other, most likely these peasants would simply be scared, and the entire camp would collapse from the inside. Liang Cheng presented a miniature of the events described. He continued to say that in addition to this, the cavalry accompanying the army had been watching them for these 2 days. Zhu San approached them with a bowl of soup in his hands and addressed the gentleman, asking him to try the soup first. Zhen Fan was slightly surprised, but took the plate. Liang Cheng concluded by saying that it looked like they were going to be used as bait. Holding the soup in his hands, Zhen Fan frowned and thought that now there is no point in telling the higher-ranking army officers or revealing information to the peasants who went with them. Now they must protect themselves, and if the conditions allow, Zhen Fan will not mind take advantage of the current situation. Deep night of the same day. The night watchman yawned and walked past the tents with a spear in his hands. One of the robbers crept up behind him with a knife, and then attacked the night watchman, covered his mouth with his hand so that he would not scream, and cut his throat with a knife. A group of robbers began to break into the tents, killing everyone inside. One of the robbers entered the tent belonging to Zhen Fan. Suddenly, Liang Cheng grabbed him by the throat. The other robbers did not understand why their ally did not come out of this tent. Before he could ask what was going on, Zhu San cut his throat. Liang Cheng left the tent, pulling out the dead robber by the hand. Zhen Fan followed him out with the order to cut off their head. They both noticed a shining arrow flying towards them from afar. A roar was heard. The robbers were riding towards them on horseback. The chief robber ordered to kill them and not take prisoners. Liang Cheng explained that Blind Base said that they were called barbarians. Zhu San quietly turned to the gentleman, asking if he knew them. Zhen Fan replied that they have been the enemies of the Yan Kingdom for over 100 years, and they are also the kind of people who never stop. Zhen Fan, Liang Cheng and Zhu San hid behind one of the tents when these barbarians burst into the camp shouting to kill them. The cavalrymen did not have time to react due to the sudden attack and tried to escape. Zhen Fan thought furiously that naturally they were bait, and since the fish was hooked, a fishing net should soon appear. Zhu San turned to the master in alarm, saying that it was too dangerous here, and why don't they just escape, given all the chaos? Zhen Fan replied with a serious look that, as far as he remembers, there is a reward in the form of gold and military merit for the heads of barbarians. Zhu San grinned conspiratorially and mentally agreed with the gentleman, thinking that he had a truly sinister heart. One of the barbarians noticed this trio and rushed to the attack, screaming. Liang Cheng came to the master's defense, taking a fighting stance. Zhu San also rushed to attack. With one quick and precise movement, he cut the throat of this barbarian, and his face expressed pleasure at what was happening. The barbarian only managed to grab his throat with his hand, and then he fell onto his horse, which screamed and rushed towards Zhen Fan. Liang Cheng could control another pair of his hands from a distance. These palms duplicated the movement of his own hands, and Liang Cheng hit the horse in the muzzle from a long distance, causing it to fall to the ground. Liang Cheng bent over the barbarian who had fallen with her and finished him off with sharp claws, piercing his throat. After that, Liang Cheng turned around to find out how his master was doing. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan swung over the barbarian's body with rage and cruelty and struck him with his great sword. Splashes of blood stained his face. He wiped his bloody cheek with his thumb and licked it with a terrifying look, saying that it was surprising to him that this blood was even a little sweet. Zhen Fan came to his senses and dropped the sword, taking a step back. He seemed to not believe what had happened, looked at his hands with fear and asked himself, had he really killed someone? Zhen Fan smiled eerily after these words and thought that this feeling did not seem so bad to him. Zhu San suddenly ran up and held out a flask with a smile, inviting the gentleman to drink it and saying that usually the first murder is very difficult to bear, but when he gets used to it, he will be able to appreciate how much fun it is. Zhu San smiled a little madly, and Zhen Fan took the flask and poured its contents onto his head. He thought that the wolf would not allow the sheep to be the leader of the pack, and if he did not change the attitude of the demon kings towards him, then at least he would make them think that he also eats meat. Zhen Fan smiled as he picked up the sword from the ground and calmly said that he was fine now. He thought about what he needed to do so that no one would doubt that he, too, was a real wolf. A new group of barbarians was already rushing towards the cavalrymen, and the cavalrymen were already fully armed and were also galloping to the attack. The cavalry general shouted that they needed to be surrounded and not take prisoners. The barbarians called the cavalrymen the dogs of the Yan Kingdom and shouted that they were approaching, and they should cast off their fear and kill them. Zhu San said with disdain, to take advantage of the lives of ordinary people to lure a turtle into a jar. Who does this general think he is? Zhu San added that it is merciless. Liang Cheng, crossing his arms over his chest, said that it would not be easy to deal with the cavalry, and they could only. Before he could finish speaking, he noticed that a spear was flying at them. Zhu San also noticed this, and both demon kings attacked Zhen Fan, knocking him to the ground, saving him from the flying spear and asking him to be careful. All three looked up and saw Barbarian. This barbarian wore a bone mask and was very strong. Liang Cheng drew his sword and rushed to attack. He lunged, swinging at the barbarian, but he managed to react and hit the sword with his own. Blue lightning shone around them. Zhen Fan was very surprised by this situation and loudly ordered Zhu San to help Liang Cheng get it, and he himself could find shelter. Zhu San rushed to attack, and Zhen Fan thought that these barbarians were targeting the goods again. Liang Cheng jumped away from the barbarian and noticed that half of his own sword was missing. The barbarian turned to Liang Cheng with a bloodthirsty smile, saying that his sword was broken. He shouted the last word as he rushed to attack. Liang Cheng dodged his attack and, frowning, said that he didn't care, because he didn't know how to use it. The barbarian was amazed by his words, but he struck again and hit. But Liang Cheng stood on his feet. The barbarian mentally asked how this dog from Yan managed to expose himself to the onslaught of his blow. Liang Cheng stood on his feet with his head down, and then his flying palm with sharp claws pierced the barbarian's body. Blood sprayed from this barbarian's mouth. And Liang Cheng, shrouded in magic, said that he prefers to use claws. The toothy mask he was wearing revealed its sharp teeth for the first time. From somewhere from the side, a new arrow flew at him. It hit his hand. Liang Cheng was very surprised and distracted from the battle, and the barbarian took advantage of this moment and kicked Liang Cheng in the stomach. The one who shot from afar shouted out Ali Gu, which was the name of the barbarian who fought Liang Cheng, to tell him to be careful. The archer added that something was wrong with Ali Gu's opponent. The archer, pulling the bowstring, said that his arrows could easily pierce an ordinary person, but Liang Cheng didn't even have armor on her hands. The archer asked then why was it only the arrowhead that pierced his arm. An angry Zhu San appeared behind the archer and shouted loudly that he would advise the archer to look around. When the archer realized that there was an enemy behind him, Zhu San had already stabbed 2 blades into his neck and jerked him down to his feet. The archer screamed heart-rendingly. Ali Gu heard his screams and turned to him, shouting his name, Atsaidu. He turned back to Liang Cheng and grabbed him by the collar, lifting him into the air and shouting that he would kill him. Zhen Fan came running to help and attacked Ali Gu from behind, but when he swung, Ali Gu managed to return and repel his attack, releasing Liang Cheng from his hands. Ali Gu coughed up blood, clutching his face with his hand. He fearfully thought that he had been poisoned. Looking at the hand full of blood, he judged that this happened at the very moment when Liang Cheng pierced his body with his claws. Zhen Fan swung, and this time he definitely aimed at the neck. Blood spattered. Ali Gu fell face down, and Zhen Fan stuck his sword into the ground and sank to his knees, breathing heavily. He was surprised to notice Liang Cheng's hand in front of him. He looked at his master with gratitude, offering help. Ali Gu accepted the hand and rose from his knees. Liang Cheng looked at him as if with warmth. He remembered the words of Blind Bei. Blind Bei once said that he knows that Liang Cheng and Zhu Sun have a low opinion of their master, but let them not forget that it was he who created them. And if the real world could be compared to a cage, then the master was locked up inside this cage. So you need to provide your master with all the conditions so that he can develop calmly. Blind Bei metaphorically peeled the tangerine and placed it in front of Liang Cheng and Zhu San. He finished the thought by saying that in that case, being their creator, he will be the one to lead them forward. And Blind Bei believes that their master is truly worthy of them following him. Liang Cheng looked at Zhen Fan with enthusiasm, and then pulled the arrow out of his hand. He told the master that the Yan army had the situation under control. Zhen Fan, sweating a little, replied that he understood everything and offered to count their trophies. Zhu San dragged someone by his clothes. With a bright child's smile, he told the gentleman that it looked like he had caught a big fish. It was an old man with a long beard and a necklace of skulls. It was a barbarian, the head of the Sands Expansion Division. Zhu San asked if they caught this old man alive. They would have more trust, right? Zhen Fan said with a terrifying look that he was sure that this old man saw perfectly well everything that happened here. Therefore, Zhen Fan ordered Zhu San to kill him. Zhu San brought the blade of his blade to the old man's throat with a mad smile. He pointed his finger at Zhen Fan with fear and said that he was a devil. Zhu San chuckled and said that the old man was right and cut his throat. Many corpses of cavalrymen and barbarians lay on the former battlefield. Officer Zhu pointed his blade at the company of demons with rage and asked, "Who?" But before he could finish speaking, he saw the severed head of the division head. In fear, he realized that the Central Army was looking for this old man. He gave an order to his cavalrymen with a gesture of his hand, and with a compassionate face he thought that this trio was very lucky, because their merits were undeniable, but, unfortunately, their merits no longer belonged to them. The cavalrymen surrounded the demon kings. Zusen thoughtfully told the master that these cavalrymen want to appropriate their booty for themselves. Zhen Fan frowned. Officer Zhu rushed to the attack shouting, "Brothers!" Suddenly, there was a bright flash of blue light, and Officer Zhu was cut in half, falling off his horse. This was done by the accompanying girl in battle armor riding a strange animal with horns, the head of a dragon and the body of an ungulate. The girl was the Marquis of Zhenbei County named Lai Kayan. Her attendant, the seventh elder, followed her on a white horse, holding a long blade in his hands. Lai Kayan turned to Zhen Fan, Liang Cheng and Zhu San with orders to clean up here and come to her tent. Some time later, Zhu San and Liang Cheng were talking in their tent. Liang Cheng asked, "Does Zhu San think their master is somehow related to this girl?" Zhu San scratched his head and said that a woman should dress like a man. According to the plot, this role usually belongs to the protagonist's harem. Liang Cheng remained silent to this. Zhu San was bathing in the bath, humming some tune. He said that this woman has a high status, and this only benefits them. In addition, they will be compensated for all losses. Liang Cheng said with a serious face that this woman was not worthy of their master. Zhu San asked irritably, "Is Liang Cheng really not even trying to hide his sycophancy now?" Liang Cheng crossed his arms over his chest and said that with them, the master can marry the best woman in the whole world. Liang Cheng asked Zhu San not to say that he didn't notice. Zhu San opened his eyes wide and asked, does Liang Cheng mean the power that has returned to them, and will it continue to return? He looked worried. Zhu San added, does Liang Cheng think that the answer lies in the master? Liang Cheng said that before the master woke up, they were ordinary people, but now they have regained their strength. Liang Cheng explained that in addition to this, their master also gained strength comparable to 10 people who were always practicing. Liang Cheng looked serious, but Zhu San interrupted his thoughts by shouting in concern that he warned the master that the general was a woman, but he did not have time to give him the proper advice. Liang Cheng asked in surprise what kind of advice. Zhu San smiled conspiratorially, and his cheeks turned a little red as he imagined Zhen Fan entering Lai Kayan's tent while she was bathing. He reported that he told the gentleman that if the woman does not allow him to go inside, he should do so immediately because most likely she is taking a bath. So the gentleman will, by pure chance, receive a wave of material benefits and then... Liang Cheng interrupted him with a gloomy look and said that she would then order her men to drag him out and chop him into pieces, after which Zhen Fan would die. Zhu San exhaled indifferently and said that Liang Cheng was vulgar. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan walked past the tents and entered the most luxurious one. He knelt down on one knee and greeted the general. Lai Kayan, without being distracted from writing hieroglyphs, said that she wanted to reward Zhen Fan for the contribution he made in that battle. She added that he was given 2 awards to choose from. The first is that he can join her personal battalion and become a member of the Lai family. And the second reward is that he can become a military officer in the Huchuo City area. She looked at him hopefully, and then looked down at the parchment again, asking him to forget about what she said and ordered him to return with her to the Lai family because she would not allow his future. Before she could finish speaking, he loudly said that he was choosing the second option. Lai Kayan stopped writing and glared at Zhen Fan, asking how dare he look down on her family. Zhen Fan quietly said that Huchuo City is his home, and he cannot bear to be separated from this place. After his words, Zhen Fan thought about the fact that she really considers him some kind of idiot, and why would he join her family and become her servant, because he is no longer talking about the fact that he would not even know how he died then. And he also wondered whether there were any vegetarians among the 7 demon kings. He thought about the latter with a smile as he imagined Ammon. Meanwhile, Ammon smiled madly, being covered in blood and looking at a whole bunch of corpses around him. He had many swords sticking out of his body, but he didn't pay attention to it. Blind Bay said that he dealt with the gang of hyenas, and the next one they will deal with is the Trinity Alliance. Ammon asked, the master has not returned yet, and yet Blind Bay dares to take the initiative. Blind Bay explained while playing an unusual musical instrument that sooner or later Zhen Fan will return, and for now they will deal with trivial things. After all, they are the owners of self-awareness and initiative. Ammon, with a dissatisfied face, pulled out his swords and threw them to the ground. He approached Blind Bay and asked what about the cart gang that was outside of town. Ammon added that he did not remember them being on their list. Blind Bay stood up and said that he left this matter to Feng Xunjian because he thinks that it will all be over soon. He was interrupted by a plaintive groan from the inn building. Blind Bay said he thought it was time to start. In the gang leader's room, the carts were covered in glowing magical threads. His face was twisted in pain, and he himself was bleeding in some places. He looked at Feng Xingyang and angrily called her names and asked what she did to them. Feng Xunjian sat far away from him on a chair, crossing her legs. She smiled slyly and held a teapot in her hand. Feng Xunjian tussed 3 times and asked, did they really dislike her tofu that much? She tilted the teapot over her head and opened her mouth wide. Liquid flowed from the spout of the teapot directly onto her tongue. She wiped her lips with her finger and mentally wondered if the master had finished his battle. Meanwhile, Liang Cheng turned to the master, saying that they would most likely reach Huchuo in a day. Zhu San added that the master need not worry about the inn, because he is sure that everything is in order there. The 3 of them sat around the fire. Zhu San said with a casual expression that, however, he did not know whether Fan Lai was able to eat in the end. Zhu San explained that he has a big appetite, so it is quite difficult to find the right amount of food outside. Zhen Fan thought with a little annoyance that it must not be easy for them to suck up to him on behalf of Fan Lai every day. Zhen Fan in a calm voice suggested that they eat and take a break. Zhu San and Liang Cheng heard footsteps and became worried. Liang Cheng said that someone was approaching. They all took a fighting stance and noticed a girl with purple hair wearing a barbarian cape. Behind her stood 2 children and 2 muscular barbarians. She said that it was quite windy here and they needed to find shelter, and then she offered to borrow this place. The company of barbarians and the company of demon kings were sitting relatively close to each other, each around their own fire. The purple-haired girl rose to her feet and waved her flask, trying to draw the demon's attention to her, offering her a drink. Zhen Fan said that the wind here is quite cold, which is why his throat hurts and he will not be able to drink. Zhen Fan, frowning, thought that these were just another barbarians, and who knows, maybe they mixed poison into this drink. It is usually expected that the offerer takes a sip first in order to prove his sincere intentions. The girl frowned, taking a sip from the flask, and said that she, the head of the barbarians, is the master of the Royal Barbarian Hall, and her name is also Ai. She pointed to the children and said that they were the grandchildren of the head of the Shadow Tribe. She added that she came here from the Royal Hall to save them. Zhen Fan tightly clenched his hand on the sword he held behind his back, his brows furrowed. He thought that it was the Shadow Tribe that had been lured away by the Lai family that time, and now they had met the real enemy. Ai stood up and said with a frown that the horses belonging to Zhen Fan, Liang Cheng and Zhu San had the seal of the Lai family on them. Are they really members of this guild? She pointed at the horses with her hand, and then her face filled with rage, and she said that County Marquis Lai Kayan really lives up to his name, and they must have done a great job to cross paths with Ai and her allies here. Zhen Fan, frowning, said that it seemed to him that there was some kind of misunderstanding. Ai asked him again with shouts, "Misunderstanding?" The flask with liquid immediately fell to the ground, and Aya was enveloped in green magic. 2 barbarians who were drinking from a flask fell to the ground, holding their throats. They were foaming at the mouth. Ai folded her hands in such a way as to make a spell and said it loudly, "Barbarian curse resurrection of corpses." The 2 barbarians immediately rose from the dead and, filled with rage, were ready to attack Zhu San, Zhen Fan, and Liang Cheng. Zhu San shouted that he knew something was wrong with her. Zhen Fan touched Liang Cheng's back and, pointing to the 2 dead barbarians, invited him to greet his relatives. After all, Liang Cheng was once an ancient Jiangshi. The resurrected barbarians rushed to attack. The terrifying mask on Liang Cheng's face opened its mouth, and he roared intimidatingly. The resurrected barbarians stopped obeying Aya. She was very surprised by this and loudly asked how he was able to rid the corpses of her control. How is this possible? She placed her fingers on the bridge of her nose and cast a spell to summon the damned barbarian eye to open. She looked at the battle with special eyes and thought that she wanted to understand the origins of this Lai family servant. She saw Yang Cheng's true appearance and realized that she was mistaken. He was all ablaze and was many times larger than his current form. AI was very tense, thinking that he did not seize control of the corpses of the barbarians. They themselves submitted to his will. Yang Cheng roared loudly, and the resurrected barbarians, looking back at AI, rushed towards her, ready to attack. She jumped away, dodging and scooping up the children in her arms. She launched a counterattack, kicking one of the resurrected barbarians in the head. Zhu-san appeared behind her, chuckling maliciously as he swung his blade at her. AI did not have time to react to him and cursed when he was about to attack her, but her eyes glowed green, and the magic that Ai's cloak exuded threw Zhu-san away. Covering himself with his hands, he thought that something was wrong with this cloak. He landed on the ground and said that if she has even a drop of courage, then she should not dare to run away. He shouted to her that she could not just escape like that. At this moment, AI quickly walked towards Zhen Fan. He was ready for her attack and thought that he wanted to pretend that he was going to block her escape route. But he did not expect that she would immediately rush towards him, and this was too much. He swung his sword at her, and she threw the girl in his direction. Zhen Fan did not expect such an action and managed to stop the blade in front of the child. The little girl cried and fell to the ground. AI grabbed his blade and asked how dare he stop her. She put the blade to his throat. He was very scared, and she said with anger in her eyes that in this case he would be the first to go to hell. A drop of blood flowed down his neck, and he himself tried to figure out what to do. He held onto the sword that AI was pressing into him. He smiled widely and thought that Aya had a surprisingly strong grip. Two dead barbarians were rushing towards AI from behind, screaming. She managed to jump away. The barbarians hit the place where she was standing. Zhen Fan didn't understand what happened, and then looked up. Directly above him in the air was AI with two children in her arms. Zhu-san was above AI and was ready to pierce her with his blade. He did this a moment later. AI screamed in pain. She managed to hit Zhu-san in the stomach, jumping away from him, and she tried to escape. Her face expressed severe pain. Zhu-san shouted angrily, "Does she think she can escape?" He was ready to rush in pursuit of her, but someone shouted at him not to follow her. Zhu-san turned around. Liang Cheng was sitting on the ground and said that in his current state, controlling two zombies is quite difficult. He has reached his limit, and he has no strength left to fight further. Liang Cheng, breathing heavily and sweating, added that if Zhu-san chases after her, then who will guard their master? Zhu-san, looking at him with a smile, said that their master's insight was at a divine level. He was able to predict the situation on the battlefield. He was able to get ahead of their opponents and stand in her way. Zhu-san added that he admires his master very much. Zhen Fan frowned and said that he failed to stop her, and then he asked if Zhu-san's dagger was poisoned. And Zhu-san smiled intimidatingly and told the master that he was so cruel that he liked him very much. AI moved far enough from the battlefield, but was very exhausted and fell to her knees. She realized that the dagger was clearly poisoned, but no matter what, the royal family's task must be completed. AI plunged into the shadows and, greatly surprised, looked up. She asked Master Aben what was he doing here. Her eyes were filled with fear, and the man right in front of her asked what happened to the young master and where is he. AI screamed loudly, "Where is their leader?" She said to tell the leader to immediately gather soldiers, because Marquis Lai Kaien's henchmen are in that direction. There are quite a few of them. She told everyone to go there, get rid of them. The allies with whom the master came, AI, said that they understood everything and ran in the direction she indicated. Aben looked at AI with narrowed eyes. He noticed a blade stuck into her back. She asked what he was staring at, and he replied that he was staring at her. This master was Fan Lai. He took up his axe and attacked AI. Some time later, he met with Zhen Fan, Liang Cheng, and Zhu San. Zhen Fan asked him, did Fan Lai recognize the dagger that belonged to Zhu San? Zhen Fan handed him a flask of water, and Fan Lai responded positively, saying that he had been sharpening it in the courtyard for half a year. Zhen Fan asked if Fan Lai slaughtered that woman. Fan Lai also responded positively and began to greedily drink from the flask. Zhen Fan, looking at him, thought that he did not expect that among the caravans that Fan Lai was traveling with, there would be barbarian spies, and by chance, Zhen Fan happened to meet this woman along the way. In the end, everything turned out quite well. And this time fate was clearly on his side. Zhen Fan continued to think as he watched his allies that he was unable to kill the two children. And if in a few decades the generation of desert rulers Tian Zhao wanted to take revenge on him, he would simply kneel before them. Fan Lai handed something to the two demon kings and said that it was for them. Zhu Sen sat on his shoulder and, taking some kind of plant from his hand, asked what it was. Is it really a shallot? Fan Lai said that if you eat these plants you can feel an unprecedented surge of energy. He explained that he has been eating these plants for several days. Liang Cheng carefully examined the plants. Zhu San looked at Fan Lai with disgust and said that ordinary people are entitled to a simple lifestyle. Meanwhile, the head of Beifeng County, Zuyi Wenju, was sitting in his chambers. With an arrogant face, he asked his servant to tell him if he thought that the Marquis and the lady could survive all this. The servant, while serving tea, said that the Marquis is a very lucky man. But Zhen Fan, who recently left, was recommended by the lady herself. The servant asked Wenju, is he really going to ignore this fact? Wenju got very angry, took a cup of tea and asked the servant, what is he talking about? He added that Zhen Fan is an ordinary commoner, and even 300 horses is too much for him. And even if they give him food and salary, will he dare to follow the flag of the rebellion when the Marquis is going through difficult times? Wenju said that if Zhen Fan had the ability to mobilize his troops, then he would recognize him. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan stood in front of the entrance to the inn and was very surprised, asking what was happening and where did everyone go. There was no one inside the inn, and Zhen Fan, Zhu San, Liang Cheng, and Fan Lai stood on the threshold. One of the servants ran out of the inn and asked the owner if he had returned. Zhen Fan nodded with a serious face and asked what happened here. The old servant asked him to relax and said that Feng Xingyang and Blind Bei had recently purchased a new house. They asked the servant to stay here in case the master returned. The servant added that they said that after earning a certain amount of money, they wanted to move to a larger place on the corner of that street. The servant pointed to the street where the expensive houses were located. Meanwhile, in the new house, in the main room, Blind Bei, Feng Xingyang, and Ammon were talking while sitting on chairs. Blind Bei explained that the monthly salary of officials in Huchuo City would be doubled according to the official's position. They are new here and just starting out, so they need to show everyone their sincerity. Kamen said that a gang of hyenas were engaged in human trafficking, and they stopped them only for the sake of their own master. He added that didn't the Three Gods Association offer them a tidy sum for this? Ammon asked Blind Bei why he rejected their proposal. Blind Bei peeled the tangerine with a smile and said that, as he said earlier, their master is an educated creator, and if he doesn't want to deal with the problems of religion, then they won't either. Feng Xunjian said that she remembers that the Manhua Blind Bei was related to a similar topic, but in the end it was closed. Drinking alcohol and crossing her legs, she quietly said that if their future business prospered, they would not have problems with money. They have been working together for a long time, and doesn't it seem to her interlocutors that it would be easier to earn money by creating soap? She took a sip of alcohol, and Blind Bei looked at her suspiciously. Feng Xunjian suddenly turned around and shouted that they were all back. Sometime later, Zhen Fan was taking a bath and 3 girls surrounded him, drying him with towels. One of them asked the gentleman how the water temperature was. He sat in the bathroom and enjoyed it, closing his eyes. Meanwhile, the Demon Kings were sitting at the table and eating. Feng Xunjian with an angry face told Blind Bei that as he asked, she organized the best bath for their master. Ammon, also frowning, asked if Blind Bei thought this was too much, and did he think that the gentleman would not decide to intervene. Blind Bei said that they still have to wait for his decision. Zhu San with an uninterested face, throwing his hands behind his head, said that these were low attempts to seduce their master. Liang Cheng with a calm face, holding alcohol in his hands, said that all this is difficult, and Fan Lai, stuffing another piece of food into his mouth and chewing it, said that the rice is delicious. Blind Bay was peeling another tangerine and said with a smile that the master should always have the opportunity to reap the fruits of their development. He added that now that their conditions have become even better, they should again give him a chance to make a choice. Ammon asked Blind Bay to stop stalling and added that he was sure that Blind Bay would cry if the master didn't like it. Zhen Fan entered the dining room and asked if the Demon Kings had eaten and drunk. Without waiting for an answer, he said that they would now move on to discussing their affairs. Sometime later, Zhu-san enthusiastically talked about their military adventures, saying that at that moment it was too late for AI to do anything. The master had already cut off her path to retreat. Feng Xungyang listened to the story with enthusiasm and interest and said that this is what should be expected from their master. Zhu-san said loudly that if they are all interested in what happened next, then let them listen carefully. Zhen Fan, meanwhile, sat on a chair with his head in his hand and read, thinking that with such sycophancy, it is not surprising that the kings of antiquity easily told various jokes. Blind Bay came with a new book for the master and said that this morning his subordinates wanted to organize a bandit group outside Huchuo City. Blind Bay added that he did not expect that the gentleman would be able to achieve recognition from the administration. He added that this would only benefit them. Zhen Fan looked at him in disbelief and thought that Blind Bay had spiritual detection, and he must have realized that Zhen Fan had almost fallen asleep. Zhen Fan realized that he had to behave like an emperor and fill the entire room with his presence. He said with a very serious face that he left all questions regarding how to use this group and how to develop it to Blind Bay. He added that Huchuo City is their first stop, and after that they will begin to expand their area of influence. Zhen Fan spoke like a true emperor. Liang Qing intervened in the conversation, saying that they could not afford to waste the 300 horses given to them by the city. Blind Bay stood up and loudly announced that of course they could not waste 300 horses, and their next goal was precisely this issue. The most important fact is that the army belongs to the Yan Empire, but in reality it is only loyal to them. Zhu-san corrected Blind Bay with a bright smile, saying that he wanted to say that the Yan Empire was loyal to their master. Blind Bay agreed to this amendment and began giving instructions. He turned to Fan Lai and Zhu-san, saying that they would integrate into their old group, since they both returned back. Then Blind Bay would leave it to them. Zhu-san agreed with a smile and said that tomorrow he would go with Fan Lai. Blind Bay continued, turning to Feng Xunjian and telling her that she would be training new girls. He allowed her to select the best of them for special training. Feng Xunjian smiled slyly after hearing his words. Blind Bay turned to Liang Cheng, saying that he and the master should train a little together before they were sent to Yemen. Blind Bay asked Liang Cheng to also allow the master to give Liang Cheng some advice. Even if it was extremely simple, it would be useful to him. Liang Cheng raised his fist to his chest in agreement. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan, a little nervous, wondered what he could advise Liang Cheng. Blind Bay bowed to Zhen Fan and said that he was finished and invited Zhen Fan to make his adjustments. Zhen Fan explained with a dejected look that Blind Bay had already said everything. Zhen Fan thought that because of them his face was growing by leaps and bounds. Ammon raised his hand and asked everyone to wait. Frowning, he asked, "What about him?" Blind Bay smiled and explained that he would have the most important mission. Emina asked how he forgot about him then. Blind Bay responded sarcastically that he was blind and added that in order to feed the 300 head of cavalry cattle, they would need a large amount of money. Ammon frowned and opened his eyes a little. He asked what should he do. Blind Bay clearly and confidently said that he would need to pick up the soap. Ammon was angry that he was entrusted with dirty work. A few days later, loud bangs and bangs were heard on the street of the inn. Liang Cheng told the gentleman that it was already quite late and suggested that we finish for today. Zhen Fan stood covered in sweat and stretched his shoulder, breathing heavily. He agreed with him and thought dejectedly that he had practiced. He was beaten for 3 days in a row, but fortunately his physical strength had increased. Zhen Fan looked at Liang Cheng, who was drying himself with a towel, and asked if he was sure that he didn't want to swim with him. Liang Cheng, taking the towel in her other hand, said that she did not like hot water and asked her master to go without him. Zhen Fan waved his hand and began to leave, agreeing with him and saying that Feng Xingyang would then call. Liang Cheng noticed that Ammon and Feng Xingyin came out onto the street. They walked together and Ammon told her that first they would release soap to earn a lot of money. Then they would develop perfume, and after that many more different products. Feng Xingyang listened to him carefully and then said, raising her index finger, that either they should play big or not play at all, and only in this way could they get the highest profit in a short period of time. Feng Xingyin turned her head towards Liang Cheng and noticed that Zhen Fan, who was training here, had already left. This shocked her, and she hurriedly began to run away shouting that it was Ammon's fault. Because of him, she forgot to give the gentleman a massage. With tears in her eyes, she shouted to the master that she was on her way. Ammon, not understanding why she reacted so sharply, looked after her, and then turned to Liang Cheng and asked him if his aura had become stronger. Liang Cheng responded negatively, saying that he thought that the matter was not in them. Ammon thoughtfully raised his index finger to his mouth and lowered his gaze, saying that it seems that everything does not depend on their own efforts. He added that he believed that they would achieve nothing this way. Ammon looked thoughtfully at the soap that was lying on the floor and said that it seemed to him that they needed to come up with a different approach. For example, they both thought, looking at the bar of soap on which there was a tag with the inscription, "New Product." But they never came up with anything. They were a little tense at the thought that someone had to bend down and pick up this soap. Liang Cheng took the initiative and leaned over. Ammon cleared his throat and said that he had developed this soap recently and Liang Cheng could use it. Blind Bei noticed them from the wrong angle and said they were so close. Ammon and Liang Cheng flinched and turned to him. They asked if something happened. Blind Bei said with a smile that there would be a meeting in the pavilion tonight. He walked past them with the words that that was all he wanted to say, and they could continue what they were doing, and added with a grin that they were very lucky that he was blind and did not see anything. They remained silent meaningfully, looking after him. Meanwhile, it was late evening. Feng Xingyin gave Zhen Fan a massage. A little angrily she asked what this zombie thinks he is. Is he even familiar with the concept of delicacy? She was clearly angry at the impact marks on Zhen Fan's body. Zhen Fan told her with a smile not to worry about it and explained that he had already relaxed. Feng Xunjian stretched his back muscles with a worried face and asked if he should come up with another way to train. Zhen Fan lay hugging a pillow with one eye closed and said that they would talk about this later, but for now he sees nothing wrong with training his body. She suggested, then maybe she should ask Ammon to bite him. Zhen Fan wondered out loud, should he become a vampire? Fatigue came over him, and he closed his eyes. Feng Xunjian continued to say that given Ammon's current state, the number of vampire conversions is limited, and such an opportunity cannot be given to the first person you meet. Late at night, the Demon Kings held a meeting without Zhen Fan in the pavilion. Blind Bei explained that the topic of their meeting today is cultivation. He was sitting at the table with Feng Xingyang behind him. Zhu San was sitting on the floor, and Fan Lai, Liang Cheng and Ammon were standing around the table. Blind Bei turned to Liang Cheng and offered to talk about the master's cultivation over the past couple of days. Liang Cheng thoughtfully raised his palm to his face and remembered how Zhen Fan handled the sword on the battlefield. Liang Cheng said that up until this point, the gentleman had no combat experience. He did not have any skills, and the reaction was quite slow. Liang Cheng added with determination that the master's strength was truly great. Hearing these words, Zhu San remembered the moment when AI almost killed the master and thought deeply. Meanwhile, Liang Cheng continued to say that Zhen Fan only woke up a month ago and did not have time to fully recover. But at the moment his strength was comparable to an adult man who practices martial arts on a regular basis. Blind Bei said with a serious face that he was always interested in one question: what is the true connection between their powers and the power of their master? He added that the principle of unconditional indulgence of the master remains unshakable, but the problem is that they managed to restore a small part of their strength, but that they did not make progress stopped. He spoke the last words with his index finger raised up. Feng Xunjian asked Blind Bei in confusion, what did he learn? Blind Bei created a glowing spell and said that his guess was that most likely the speed of their recovery is directly related to the strength of their master. If we look at this situation from the perspective of an online game, they are just children and their own level cannot exceed that of their master. Liang Cheng thoughtfully held his chin with his thumb and forefinger and said that in other words, since the master is still at the first level of they. Ammon interrupted him by saying that the master's growth rate depended only on himself. He asked if there really was power in them, but the master suppressed it. Blind Bei answered eerily that this was so. Fan Lai scratched his head and suggested that if he cuts the master, then this restriction will subside. Everyone present tensed up greatly as they realized Fan Lai's words. Liang Cheng broke the silence and took the teapot on the table in his hands and said that when they were ordinary people, they swore that they would allow their master to choose for themselves, and then they wanted to protect him. Liang Cheng poured the contents of the teapot into the cup, and Feng Xinyang watched his actions with a slight frown. Ammon was lost in thought, looking at the contents of his cup. Liang Cheng continued to say that now that they had regained some of their strength, they had become insatiable. He added that he was ashamed. He knew that he was not suitable for such things, but nevertheless. Everyone present held cups of wine and looked at Liang Cheng. Liang Cheng suggested that everyone drink this wine and forget about what was said here, just like other bad thoughts. Liang Cheng looked scary. They all drank wine together. After this, Blind Bei told the others to let them know that if the player dies, the creatures summoned by him cannot continue to exist, so they can only become stronger by increasing the power of their master. Yet their cultivation systems are not suitable for the master, which leads to the conclusion that they must find him a teacher. Feng Xinyang thought for a while, and then asked Blind Bei if he called them here to say that they could only connect themselves with the master by hiring him a teacher. Ammon asked in surprise why Blind Bei didn't tell about this earlier, and what was the problem. Zhu San agreed with them, and added that this was somehow humiliating. Blind Bei laughed and said that, to be honest, he didn't expect Fan Lai to say that out loud either. Fan Lai pointed his finger at himself and asked if he was to blame. After some time, they were in the desert with the same composition. Feng Zungian told Blind Bei that she ordered her maid to ask her master to wait for them to return. She looked around the local areas and asked Blind Bei if he was sure that the teacher would be passing through here. Zhu San held his chin and looked at Blind Bei with suspicion. He said that they had already discussed everything last night, and today they even discovered their target. Zhu San turned to Blind Bei, asking if he had thought of everything from the very beginning. Blind Bei asked with a gloomy look. In their opinion, he should not have done this. He added that the fact is that the wife of the captain of the guards sent him a message through her maid, and today her husband had a business trip to take place, and she asked Blind Bei to send her a water charm in order to help her get pregnant. Blind Bei was drawing a road map on the ground with a stick. Zhu San, chuckling with sarcasm, repeated fragments of Blind Bei's phrase that this was a business trip. Water charms were used there. He needed to help her get pregnant. Blind Bei continued to say that the maid also said that today a bandit would be sent to a nearby city for a trial. Blind Bei drew a picture of a prisoner in a cage on wheels on the ground with a stick. He added that in addition to being a former government official, the bandit is also a martial artist. Liang Cheng, carefully studying the drawings, asked how big the convoy would be. Zhu San asked thoughtfully, is a recognized martial artist really suitable to be their master's teacher? Ammon said that, as far as he knows, they managed to cripple him. He asked if it seemed to his allies that because of this his opportunities as a teacher were greatly reduced. Blind Bei sighed loudly and began to jabber that last night they were discussing a suitable candidate for the role of teacher for their master, and today a suitable target turned up for them. What does it mean? This means that luck is on their side, and the Lord has given them this opportunity. This is destiny. The Lord is watching over their master, the chosen one, and they cannot afford to neglect the will of the Lord and are obliged to obey their destiny. And it is also an honor for them to follow their master. Blind Bei was full of determination and said all this, spreading his arms and smiling widely. Fan Lai, meanwhile, looked into the distance in search of their target. Zhu San, a little annoyed, called Blind Bei a blind idiot and asked if he was completely crazy. Zhu San added that the master is not here. So why would Blind Bei suddenly praise him here? Zhu San came to a realization and started yelling at Blind Bei, loudly saying that he was cheating with his spiritual detection. Blind Bei laughed quietly as Zhen Fan rode up to them on a horse. He dismounted and stood next to Feng Xingyang, asking, so they were going to find him a teacher? He added that they have a lot of desire. Zhen Fan's sweat dropped and thought that when other people are looking for teachers, they are looking for a relationship where they can discuss something. But when it comes to him, they are directly trying to rob someone. Zhu called him master and was about to say something, but Blind Bei put his hand on his shoulder, mentally ordering him to shut up. Blind Bei said that he managed to achieve a large network of stalls, and soon they will be hunted, and their only defense will be their own strength. Therefore, Zhen Fan did not let him finish and agreed, saying that they could make the necessary decisions. Zhu looked at Blind Bei a little surprised. Blind Bei reproachfully turned to Zhu telepathically, thinking that now is not the time to tell the master that he can restrain their power. Otherwise, he will certainly start thinking about what Fan Lai said last night, and in this case, their relationship will be in danger. Blind Bei told all the demon kings that since the master had given them his permission, they should be ready, because this time all 6 would participate. Blind Bei hesitated for a moment, and then loudly corrected himself, saying that all 7 would participate. He asked if everything was clear to everyone. Ammon, Liang Cheng, and Zhu thought with disdain that Blind Bei was a blind idiot, and just didn't consider the master to be a person. Sometime later, while Zhen Fan was sitting with his back resting on one of the stones and wiping his sword, Zhu sat down next to him and said that he had just returned from tailing and he managed to discover that another group was watching their target. And it seems that this time everything will be even more confusing. Blind Bei turned to the master, saying that they were waiting for his decision. Zhen Fan said that in their time it is difficult to find a worthy teacher. A group of cavalrymen, together with a prisoner in a cage on wheels, was already passing by. Zhen Fan said with a fearsome look and determination that, according to the saying, the mantis catches the cicada while the sparrow waits behind him. Therefore, isn't it better to be a sparrow? Late at night, a group of cavalrymen were attacked. Flaming arrows were flying at them, and warriors were attacking them with blades. One of the cavalrymen shouted loudly that the enemy was attacking. The guard captain was ready to go into battle, but the prisoner sitting in the cage shouted that these were people from northern Fengliu. He added that he knew about their dealings with the barbarians, and they would never let him go. He addressed the captain of the guard as if he were little Li and told him to take his men away. This guard captain was the patrol captain of Fuchuo City. His name was Wang Lai. Pondering the prisoner's words, he turned to his men and rushed to fight. The prisoner shouted loudly, "Didn't Wang Lai say that his daughter-in-law was pregnant?" The prisoner tried to reason with Wang Lai, saying that he should not die in vain. He begged him to come back, but Wang Lai did not listen to him. Lamenting the inability to help, he quietly said that Wang Lai could live like this. Why would he do this? This prisoner is the former captain of Fuchuo City. His name is Dingzhu. Suddenly, deafening sounds were heard. Dingzhu tensed and began to get nervous. Everyone who fought grabbed their ears, unable to withstand these sounds. It was Blind Bei who played the musical instrument, erhu, and asked with a smile where he could find a bosom friend in this world. Blind Bei landed in the center of the battlefield, and all the warriors rushed at him after someone shouted that he was an expert and should be killed. Feng Xunjian's quiet laughter was heard. She pierced the warriors with threads with a terrifying expression on her face, clearly enjoying what she was doing. Liang Cheng, Ammon, and Zhu also rushed to attack. Liang Cheng pierced the warriors right through with his claws. Ammon bit them, sucking their blood, and Zhu twisted their necks. Fan Lai took the prisoner over his shoulder and began to leave with Blind Bei. Blind Bei loudly shouted to Ammon, Liang Cheng, and Zhu that they would cover their retreat. He added that Feng Xunjian will clear the way for them, and they will escape from here. There were many bloody bodies lying on the field. Wang Lai knelt in front of the swordsman and coughed. His torso was cut, and he fell on his chest. The swordsman rushed to attack Blind Bei. Blind Bei used magic while playing his era. The swordsman's eyes widened, and he immediately exploded. Not even a wet spot remained from him. Dingru, being on Fan Lai's shoulder, thought of Blind Bei. If this killer could defeat Little Lai, he was on the threshold of the 9th level. Why did this blind man kill him so easily? Dingru was very nervous, and Blind Bei ordered Fan Lai to leave. Fan Lai exhaled and ran with amazing speed for a body of such size. Blind Bei was also ready to leave. but behind him a call was heard from Wang Lai. He asked if Blind Bei could convey his last words to his wife. Blind Bei exhaled and asked Wang Lai not to worry, because he would take care of her himself. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan was sitting on a horse at the entrance to the gorge and heard loud footsteps. He looked into the distance and made a surprised face when he saw Fan Lai, creating a lot of dust, rushing towards him. Zhen Fan turned around and extended his hand towards them, shouting at Fan Lai to quickly put the prisoner on the horse. Fan Lai ran past him, screaming heart-rendingly. Zhen Fan, surprised by this behavior, asked him to wait a minute. Some time later, Zhen Fan was sitting in a gazebo in the pavilion, and Blind Bei and Feng Xingyang stood next to him and bowed to him. Blind Bei turned to the master, saying that it took them some time to get rid of the enemies, but fortunately the teacher remained unharmed. The first thing Fan Lai did was send him back. Zhen Fan, throwing his head back on the chair, said that this was good. Raising his head, he asked Fan Lai to lower the teacher down. Blind Bei, continuing to bow, congratulated his master on having a teacher. Zhen Fan thought with irritation that he had finally returned his teacher. Zhu San told the master that things were bad. Zhu San leaned over Ding Ru and, a little nervously, said that when Fan Lai returned to the city, it seemed to him that Fan Lai was somehow agitated. It seemed that Zhen Fan's teacher had died. Zhen Fan smiled sarcastically, sweat dripping down his face. He mentally asked, "Is this some kind of joke?" The next day, early in the morning, Ding Ru was lying on the street of the inn. Blind Bei was sitting on his knees next to him, and Zhen Fan was standing behind him. Zhen Fan asked how his pulse was. With a dejected look, he thought that the Demon Kings wasted the whole day, and the person they brought back was turned inside out. Is this some kind of joke? Blind Bei, meanwhile, checked his pulse, and then turned to the gentleman with a serious look, saying that he was a psychiatrist. Zhen Fan, frowning, said that it seemed to him that there was no hope, because Ding Ru had neither a pulse nor breathing. Rising, Blind Bei agreed with him and offered to bury Ding Zhu. Turning to the master and smiling, Blind Bei added that, however, if they buried him, it would be a great loss. Blind Bei remembered that they had a beautiful flower garden in their backyard. He suggested cutting Ding Zhu into pieces and making fertilizer out of them, which means treating him the same way as the others before him. Zhen Fan exhaled heavily and said that he agreed, thinking that he always felt out of place next to Blind Bei. Maybe it's because he's not crazy enough. A heavy groan was heard. It was Ding Zhu. He woke up and began to crawl somewhere. Blind Bei immediately shouted to the master to see that Ding Ru had woken up. He added that this is what one would expect from Master. Although tainted by the Lord's luck, he is still worthy of help from the heavens themselves. Sometime later, at the inn, Blind Bei approached Zhen Fan and said that before he could call this person his teacher, they needed to discuss the necessary etiquette with him. He asked to leave this matter to his subordinates, because Blind Bei is confident that Zhen Fan will be able to begin his training from tomorrow. Zhen Fan asked him to be polite with Ding Ru and said that he should not be rude to him. Blind Bei approached Ding Ru, saying that as far as they knew, Ding Ru was a martial artist. Blind Bei suggested we talk about it. He and Feng Xingyang stood in front of Ding Ru, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Ding Zhu never replaced his torn gray old kimono. Blind Bei condescendingly said that if Ding Zhu agreed to train their master in martial arts, then they would ensure his safety. Ding Ru quietly replied that, as he said, he did not remember agreeing to be their master's teacher. Blind Bei and Feng Xunjian's faces became terrifying. Feng Xingyang was ready to pounce on Ding Ru. She said that she had seen a huge number of heroes turn into real cowards after torture, and was about to head towards him, but Blind Bei interrupted her, stopping her with a hand gesture. He said that after all, this is their master's teacher. The master taught them to convince people with the help of virtue. But Blind Bei added, turning to Feng Xingyang, that he suddenly remembered that the day before yesterday the wife of the patrol captain, whose name is Wang Lai, owed him a certain amount of money for the revelation. Turning to Feng Xunjian with a smile, Blind Bei told her that she could go there right now and slaughter the entire Wang Lai family. Ding Zhu was filled with rage and shouted at Blind Bei. Blind Bei turned to Ding Ru again and apologized, saying that there was a personal matter that needed to be dealt with. He asked again what Ding Ru said. Ding Zhu, Gritting his teeth and frowning, said that he agreed. He thought that Little Lai's daughter-in-law was pregnant, but he lost his life trying to protect Dingru. Dingju asked himself, should he involve Little Lai's family in this because of some little thing? Blind Bei turned to Feng Xingyang. He added with a smile that he thought and decided that they should not slaughter the entire family for some money. This is against what their master taught them. Blind Bei, leaving, suggested that we just forget about it. As he reached out to open the door, he turned around and turned to Dingju, saying that from now on he would live here. For now, this was all the information that Blind Bei was willing to give him. And if they were satisfied with the quality of his training, we are ready to discuss with him the amount of further compensation. Blind Bei added that, for example, they might consider restoring his cultivation to the state it was in before he was injured. Dingju couldn't believe his ears. Sweat was running down his face, and his eyes were wide open. He asked if Blind Bei was trying to trick him. Blind Bei responded in the negative with a big smile, saying that they were just being very generous to their people. He then left the room, followed by Feng Xingyang. Blind Bei finally promised Dingru that the day their master achieved cultivation, Dingru would regain his strength, and after that he would be able to take revenge on the so-called Northern Fengliu family on his own. But this is only if Dingru can establish a good relationship with their master, and if he gives them an order, they will help carry out revenge. Sometime later, Blind Bei was standing near a very large tree in their garden. He turned to Feng Xingyang, who was standing next to him. He said that, as he said, they must convince people with the help of virtue, and they should not think only about torture all the time. It is too primitive. Feng Xinjian obediently agreed with him and said that Blind Bei taught her a worthy lesson. Angry, she added that she knew that Blind Bei was a real devil, but she didn't think that he could be so ruthless. She asked how dare Blind Bei threaten the lives of Wang Lai's family. Blind Bei smiled and said that Wang Lai gave his life to protect Dingru. And is it inappropriate to bully Dingru based on the lives of Wang Lai's family? Feng Xunjian nodded timidly, and then said with a terrifying face that this is quite appropriate, but is Blind Bei willing to kill his own unborn child? Blind Bei was a little surprised at her words, and then casually added that the child in Wang Lai's wife's belly was not his. Feng Xungyang, with a face expressing fake regret, asked loudly, is he infertile? Blind Bei calmly replied that he did not touch her, and only made her drink intoxicating water and used it to help her manage her emotions. Blind Bei added that Wang Lai's wife calmed down her emotions and managed to get pregnant. Feng Xunjian breathed a sigh of relief and asked why Blind Bei didn't say this earlier, because she already thought that Blind Bei was ready to part with his own child. Feng Xunjian put her hand to her chest and said that Blind Bei scared her quite a lot. Blind Bei, with a serious face, said that he was pure and noble, and she, on the contrary, was dirty and evil. Remembering something important, he asked Feng Xingyang to call Ammon here. Blind Bei added that a little later he would ask their warrior for a Kai circulation map. He asked Feng Xingyang to take this card and place it on Ammon's body. Feng Xungian said indifferently that if the needle stuck in Ammon's body, it would hurt. Blind Bei asked if she could hold on. Feng Xunjian licked her lips with a scary face and said that she couldn't. Sometime later, Blind Bei, Feng Xungian, and Ammon were in one of the rooms of the inn. Blind Bei talked about how each family has their own method of martial arts training, and first their family will need to concentrate the Kai in the empty point. Feng Xingyang dropped a few coins on Ammon's body and asked, is this point located here? She began to draw a sharp needle over Ammon's body, leaving bloody marks. She left cuts on his arms, torso, neck, and chin. Blind Bei continued to say with a smile that after the Kai gathers at this point, it will split into 5 directions. A coin fell on Ammon's forehead, and Feng Xingyang drew a line with the needle to this coin, leaving a bloody trail behind her. Blind Bei explained that this energy will be directed towards the head and limbs. Ammon, with a calm face, said to Feng Xingyang, who was looming over him, that one wrong move and he was dead. Feng Xunjian calmly asked him not to worry and said that she knew what she was doing. Dingru sat not far from them and asked Blind Bei with a worried look, why don't they draw this diagram on paper? Blind Bei, turning to him with a smile, replied that everything was in order, and the drawing would not be informative enough. and the human body was perfect for a visual example. He asked Feng Xingyang to continue. After this, Blind Bei turned to Ammon, asking him to concentrate the power in his body and use his heart and lungs as a gas pedal. Blind Bei ordered Ammon to speed up the flow of Kai using her blood circulation over and over again. Ammon clarified that is, after repeating this cycle many times, they will be able to achieve acceleration of all bodily functions, thereby strengthening them many times over, and their body will begin to shine. Dingru, frowning, smiled slightly and said that this was true, and if their body began to shine, it would mean that Ammon had reached the threshold of the martial arts realm. In this state, he could take the role of a small leader in the army. Afterward, Dingzhu explained that it took him 10 years to become a 9th-level martial artist, and even that amount of time is considered quite fast. Blind Bei turned to Ammon and asked him to try, despite Dingzhu's words, because the necessary route was already emblazoned on his body, so he could easily follow it. Ammon, frowning, said that he, a vampire, knew nothing about this Kai and blood Kai. Blind Bei agreed, saying that this may indeed be true, but nevertheless Ammon is able to control blood. Blind Bei asked him to just guide her to the right place. Blind Bei added that if the blood moves fast enough, the blood will be able to carry the wind, and this wind will become the Kai they need. Ammon gave in, saying that it was hard to argue with Blind Bei's words. Dingzhu was worried about everything that was happening and said that it is not necessary to put in all your efforts at once, because all this must be done gradually. First, Ammon needs to strengthen his body and achieve a strong physique. No matter how lucky he is, this risk cannot be reduced in any way. You won't be able to achieve everything in one go. But it was too late. Ammon closed his eyes and tried to do what he was told. Energy shone around him with red flashes and a breath of wind. Dingzhu was very surprised by this and thought that Ammon was just lying on the table. He asked out loud, "Is it that simple?" After everything that happened, Feng Xinyan also tried to use Kai energy. She stood in front of the mirror, and energy flowed around her in pink streams. Feng Xunjian smiled as she looked at herself and said that pink was very suitable for a young girl. She added that she liked it. Ammon exhaled heavily and said that this is just not at her age. He was putting on his clothes while Feng Xunjian looked back at him and said with an angry expression that this was much better than his disgusting red color. Blind Bei touched Ammon's chin with a smile, drawing attention to himself and saying that he would get dressed a little later, because Blind Bei also wanted to try using Kai. Ammon was a little nervous and said that Blind Bei is blind, and what difference does it make to him whether Ammon is dressed or not? Blind Bei, raising his index finger up, said with a smile that he wanted to feel like he was at some kind of ritual. Ammon remained silent with displeasure. Blind Bei ran his fingers along the lines that were on Ammon's body and tried to apply Kai energy. For him it was expressed in blue streams of energy. Blind Bei smiled at his strength and said that it was quite simple and he liked the ancient unique color. Zhu-san, Fan Lai and Liang Cheng entered the room. Zhu-san sat on Fan Lai's shoulder and asked if this was the same cultivation system created for their master. Blind Bei said with a smile that they came just in time and they should try to. Ammon irritably declared that he wanted to get dressed. Liang Cheng was the first of the new arrivals to try to use Kai energy. For him, it was expressed in purple streams. Ammon asked with contempt, "Purple, isn't this color too colorful?" Feng Xunjian, in response to his comments, asked who would speak. Ammon exhaled dejectedly and asked her, will she never forget that incident with the soap? When Zhu-san tried to use Kai energy, this energy was expressed in green streams, and he clearly did not like it. He asked, can he change the color, or can it be repainted somehow? He looked depressed. Feng Xingyan laughed and covered her mouth with her palm and congratulated Zhu-san, saying that this color of nature itself and this color would help him hide when attacked in the wild. Zhu-san grabbed his head and began to leave irritably. But Fan Lai forced him and Zhen Fan to look back. Fan Lai screamed furiously, emitting Kai energy. Zhu-san asked him not to force himself with a mocking expression. Blind Bei applauded them all and said that for now they could only reach halfway to level 9. The next step would be. He didn't finish and started another thought, saying that, to be honest, this process seemed quite simple to him, but they could not force it to speed up. He pointedly added that they were being held back by an invisible barrier. So the next step was very simple. They must do everything possible to help their master. Blind Bei said his last words, filled with determination. Feng Xingyan smiled. Ammon had an indifferent expression on her face. Liang Cheng listened attentively with his arms crossed over his chest. Fan Lai smiled good-naturedly, and Zhu San, as always, sat with a crazy grimace and smile. Noon the next day. Ding Ru explained to Zhen Fan that this is usually how they pass on their martial arts. Ding Ru asked, "Did Zhen Fan understand everything?" Zhen Fan, standing on legs wide apart and knees bent, kept his hands clenched into fists. Closing his eyes, he asked, what exactly was he supposed to understand? Behind him stood a worried Feng Xingyang, and behind her stood Ammon, who was watching Zhen Fan's training. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan, feeling completely tense, thought that he just listened to a bunch of theory and looked at the lines on Ammon's body for a bit. Is this all it will take for him to ascend to heaven? Zhen Fan believes that the demon kings think too highly of him. Zhen Fan glanced at Ding Ru, who was sitting in a wheelchair with a frown. Zhen Fan thought that it seems that the master is also a very ordinary person. He is not as crazy as the others. Blind Bei, with all the other demon kings behind him, asked Ding Ru, is there an easy way? Maybe something like external stimulation. Blind Bei thought that their master was starting from scratch, so he needed simpler and more straightforward instructions. Ding Ru replied that some people have a much harder time sensing the presence of Kai in their body, so they have to take Ushi powder to stimulate their evil Kai. This is an impact on the human body with your aura in order to cloud the internal Kai. Ding Ru was serious. Blind Bei turned to Liang Cheng and asked him to use his evil Kai to stimulate the master's meridians. Liang Cheng made circular movements with his index finger in the air and agreed, saying that his Kai was pure and could be controlled, but it would hurt a little. Liang Cheng pointed his index finger at Zhen Fan's chest and concentrated his Kai energy in his hand. Blind Bei asked him to be careful and not harm the master. Meanwhile, Liang Cheng had already touched the middle of Zhen Fan's chest with his index fingernail, and he, in turn, closed his eyes and clenched his jaw. Zhen Fan frowned because he felt something. Kai energy flowed through Liang Cheng's finger into Zhen Fan's body. Zhen Fan, without changing his posture, thought that he felt a slight soreness and numbness, and also a slight pain radiating from the chest to the rest of the body. He opened his eyes, bloodshot, and turned blue, sweating profusely. Zhen Fan began to cough loudly, losing his balance. Foam poured out of his mouth, and snot flowed from his nose. He was drenched in sweat. Zhu San loudly shouted at Liang Cheng to stop. Liang Cheng himself was surprised by everything that was happening. He removed his finger from Zhen Fan, and the flow of Kai energy into his body stopped. Ammon, frowning, asked if Liang Cheng had infected him with corpse poison. Liang Cheng calmly examined his index finger and said that he was sure that not a drop of corpse poison had entered the master's body. Feng Xinyan ran to the gentleman's aid, calling out to him. Zhu San also tried to help. Feng Xingyan burst into rage and turned to Liang Cheng. She asked how can he say that he is sure. She added that Blind Bei asked Liang Cheng to stimulate him with his evil Kai, and Liang Cheng did a great job. Because of him, the gentleman almost got Alzheimer's. Liang Cheng calmly said that this was out of the question. He added that he had only infused a small amount of his evil Kai into his body, and considering his current level of power, it shouldn't be that bad. Ding Ru, meanwhile, scratched his beard and suggested that perhaps the reason for this was the extremely dense blood and Kai that flowed in the master. Ding Ru added that it looked like an armful of dry branches that Liang Cheng set on fire with his evil Kai. Zhen Fan sat on the floor with his legs crossed and his head bowed, and Feng Xinyan and Zhu San, worried about him, held him with their palms. Realization dawned on Blind Bei. He asked if this meant that their master had a predisposition for martial arts. Feng Xingyan, Ammon, Liang Cheng, Zhu San, Fan Lai were delighted and all at the same time thought that this was great and meant that their master was really strong. That evening, Zhen Fan was lying in his bed, and Blind Bei was kneeling next to the bed. Zhen Fan opened his eyes and asked the gentleman how he was feeling. Does he feel his Kai? Zhen Fan said with an exhausted look that he felt it, and it was very dense. Ding Ru, who was nearby, said with a smile that when an ordinary person begins to learn martial arts, initially he is only able to sense blood or perhaps small streams of blood flowing in his body, but at the moment, Zhen Fan is able to sense the circulation of his dense Kai, and it's wonderful. Dingzhu congratulated him on this. Blind Bei nodded modestly, also with a smile, and said that he congratulated the gentleman. All the other demon kings bowed down to the Lord and touched their right hands to their chest, saying that the Lord has exceptional talent. They congratulated him and said that a great destiny awaited him. Blind Bei, surprised by their presence, turned around and looked at them. They all had terrifying faces and glowing eyes. They thought about how they had almost allowed this blind idiot to suck up to the master first. Blind Bei became very angry, sensing their gloating. Zhen Fan waved them away with his palm and asked them to keep quiet. Late in the evening of the same day, Zhu San was sitting on an outdoor table. Blind Bei, holding a lantern and a piece of parchment, asked why Zhu San went to Ding Hao. Zhu San took this piece of paper and said that he wanted to ask what kind of food can help a person improve his skills. Perhaps this could help their master increase his strength from the 9th to the 8th, or even the 7th level. The piece of parchment that Zhu San took was a list of preparations for Zhen Fan's cultivation. Blind Bei said with a calm face that in this case, they might face the consequences of growing too quickly. What if the master would be stuck at the 7th level forever? Blind Bei added that in this case, the same fate awaits them. Turning around, Blind Bei began to leave, and with a smile advised Zhu San not to be smart, and if they found out that Zhu San was going to give the master some kind of drug. He didn't finish his sentence, but Zhu San got the hint. He closed his eyes, spread his hands, and said that just in case, he wanted to ask this, and in fact, he did not plan to give these drugs to Zhen Fan. Blind Bei finally added that today they went a little too far, because they tried to bite off too big a piece. Moreover, none of them know for sure when Mo Wang, who is a demonic pill, will wake up. Zhu San jumped up after Blind Bei and asked with a smile, "How does this concern Mo Wan?" Blind Bei smiled and asked Zhu San to tell him what would happen if they continued to put pressure on their master like they did today. Either Zhen Fan will want to stay with them even more, or he will decide to live with Mo Wan. Zhu San, with a crazy smile and tearing the list into 2 parts, turned to Blind Bei, saying that he admits that Blind Bei has always been quite smart and has always been able to read other people, but he knows nothing about Mo Wan's character and habits. He asked, smiling even wider, if Blind Bei was wondering why Mo Wang had not yet removed the seal from himself. Blind Bei's face became serious. He asked if Zhu San would tell him about this. Zhu San, still with the same crazy smile, continued to say that it seemed to him that if Mo Wang really woke up, the first thing he would do was kill their master and leave this world. Zhu San imagined Mo Wang killing the master and asking with an ominous look whether Zhen Fan deserved to be his father. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan was relaxing in the hot spring, with Feng Xingyang sitting on the ground next to him and serving him grapes. She asked if he liked these grapes. She added that in her opinion they were too big and the best tasting grapes should be much smaller and creamier. Zhen Fan had a towel on his face and said that he shouldn't say such vulgar things in the middle of the night. Feng Xunjian put a grape in his mouth and asked if the Demon Kings were putting too much pressure on him. Zhen Fan responded negatively, saying that today he simply felt as if he had caught a fever just because of the evil Kai. And of course, there was little pleasant in it. Feng Xunjian suggested that maybe she should give him a massage then. He answered in the negative and said that he would stay here a little longer and then go to bed, because he had classes tomorrow. Feng Xunjian stood up and began to leave with a sad face, holding a plate of grapes. She obeyed the master's words and said that she would then leave him, and wished him a good rest. As she left, Feng Xingyang turned around and thought that although the gentleman is an ordinary person, at the same time, he is the one who created them. She continued to think that the author immersed in a horror manhwa is still the same. Deep down, he must be a sensitive and lonely person, and she feels like they are putting too much pressure on him, and maybe she should tell him the truth? She looked worried, but turned around and walked away. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan took off the towel from his face. He exhaled heavily and said out loud that what happened during training was unpleasant, but there was no other way for him to increase his strength. Zhen Fan asked why the Demon Kings would even show respect to such a disgusting master like him. Isn't it strange? Zhen Fan saw Mo Wang in the water in front of him, and, calling him son, he began to get out of the hot spring. Leaving the inn, Zhen Fan said that Dad misses Mo Wang. The stone that was Mo Wan now glowed and sent waves through the water. Afterwards, the water began to swirl around this pebble, like in a funnel. Blind Bei was sitting in his office and writing something, but in an instant a realization came to him. Not believing what was happening, he asked out loud, Mo Wan. Blind Bei tensed up and said out loud that he felt a strong thirst for murder. And was this thirst really aimed at himself? Or maybe to Zhen Fan? Sometime later, Feng Xingyin and Zhen Fan stood on the threshold of their house and watched as people holding a funeral walked down the street. Zhen Fan asked, have the people who are forced to deliver food come back yet? How many of them managed to survive? Feng Xingyin bowed and replied that only a couple of hundred survived. This morning, most families in the city began to hold funerals. Feng Xingyang added that the gentleman returned just after his merits, so he was several days ahead of them. This time a huge number of people died, and it seems that soon a census will be held in Huchuo City again. Zhen Fan asked with a serious expression, so they accepted refugees to save tax revenue. Liang Qing approached them and, turning to the gentleman, said that the magistrate had just sent an order requiring Zhen Fan to appear at the courthouse before noon. Liang Qing bowed, placing his hand on his chest. Zhen Fan paid attention to him and asked if something happened. After some time, Zhen Fan walked out of the courthouse and carried clothes in his hands. It was a board member's outfit. Blind Bei congratulated the gentlemen that they were now members of the board, and the next step would be to take advantage of this position. Blind Bei, rolling a cigarette, said that he had heard that the problem of orphans would be discussed at this meeting. Zhen Fan, handing over clothes to Liang Cheng, explained that because of the war, hundreds of orphans were admitted to the orphanage today. Zhen Fan added that he is sure that there will be even more of them in the future, because they plan to assign them to lieutenants of all levels. Zhen Fan smiled, looked at the cigarette he was holding in his hands, and explained that it was good that he managed to make several cigarettes. Blind Bei approached the gentleman and said that he thought they should reconsider the decision to adopt orphans. Liang Cheng intervened in the conversation, saying that since this was an order from above, they would be forced to take 1 or 2 children, but they still had to distribute these children according to the power and influence of each person. Blind Bei explained with a smile that he was not saying that he was against this idea. On the contrary, it seemed to him that this would be too little. Liang Cheng asked with an indifferent look, how many orphans does he need? Blind Bei, squeezing his hand intimidatingly, said that he needed everyone. He explained that if they received all the orphans, they would have an empty house in their hands in which they could set up an orphanage. Liang Cheng asked if he had gone crazy and was he going to open an orphanage? Blind Bei replied that it seemed to him that these were the consequences of Rule 404, which his Manhua was subjected to. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan passed a cigarette under his nose. Blind Bei, opening an old lighter, turned to the gentleman, saying that he was thinking about this only because he wanted to personally raise the future generation. Blind Bei with a smile brought the lighter to the cigarette and added that in this way they would be able to weed out a defective product that does not suit their plans at the very beginning of the journey. Zhen Fan said that in addition, in this way they can win everyone's love and attention. Zhen Fan took a drag from his cigarette and then, exhaling the smoke, said with an arrogant look to Blind Bei that it was much easier to understand him when he expressed himself this way. Zhen Fan turned around and, filled with determination, began to move towards the house, telling the servants that it was time for them to return, because they had a lot of work ahead. Zhen Fan and Ding Ru were training in the pavilion. Ding Zhu said that he thought that today they could finish this, and asked him to remember this feeling, because tomorrow they would try to speed up this process. Zhen Fan began to be able to create small translucent streams of Kai energy. Zhen Fan asked the master how long should he shine like this. Ding Ru replied with a calm face that rushing would not speed up his path to his goal, and given his current progress, he could be halfway to the 9th level in a maximum of 3 days, and in 2 months he could fully reach this stage. Zhen Fan exhaled heavily and, wiping his face, said that Ding Ru can rest today, and Zhen Fan himself will come tomorrow afternoon. Dingru nodded to him with a smile, and Zhen Fan began to leave. As soon as Zhen Fan stopped looking at Dingru, Dingru immediately tensed, frowned, and thought that, except for those 6 psychos who had reached halfway to the 9th level in an instant, this person's talents scared him. Dingru continued to think that they say that he is the one teaching them, but it all seems more like they are just holding him back. And are they really disciples of some big sect that are enjoying a quiet life? Dingru covered his face with his hand, not understanding his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Blind Bei lit another cigarette for Zhen Fan and told the gentleman that after lunch, he and Zhu San would go to a company soap and perfume for sale in Tumen City. Blind Bei added that Fan Lai and the remaining 2 went to the desert again to see if they could bring more people here. Zhen Fan asked with an indifferent face, "Are 3 people really enough for this task?" Blind Bei replied with a smile that he warned them not to take any action unless they were completely sure that it was necessary. While Zhen Fan exhaled smoke, Blind Bei said that given the speed of their movements, it would most likely take them about a month to find information. Zhen Fan turned his head to Blind Bei and said that he did not quite understand what exactly Blind Bei wanted to tell him. Blind Bei replied with a smile that he wanted to say that Zhen Fan should not worry about anything. Blind Bei thought that 1 month would be enough for the gentleman to reach the 9th level. Blind Bei remembered something and, raising his index finger up, added with a smile that since 5 of them were already absent at the moment, starting tomorrow night, Feng Xingyan would be by Zhen Fan's side 24 hours a day. Zhen Fan coughed out cigarette smoke at this news and asked with a displeased face if Blind Bei was sure that this was a good idea. Blind Bei replied that they could not risk his safety. He added that Feng Xingyang would be responsible for protecting him, and of course, if he could reach level 9 faster, it would greatly lighten her burden. Blind Bei also asked if Zhen Fan could always carry Mo Wang with him. Zhen Fan exhaled heavily and replied that Mo Wan was not getting out of the stone. Blind Bei replied that he was sure that if Zhen Fan was in danger, then Mo Wan would certainly show up. Zhen Fan asked if Blind Bei thought that Mo Wan still loved him. Blind Bei responded in the negative, saying that he thought that Mo Wang was just dreaming of getting a look at Zhen Fan before he died. Zhen Fan darkened and ignored this statement. Blind Bei added that he needed to prepare for the journey, so he asked Zhen Fan for permission to leave. Zhen Fan exhaled and gave his consent. Blind Bei entered the building and closed the doors, but then suddenly heard a voice belonging to Feng Xunjian, who said that this was too much. Blind Bei turned to her with a surprised look. Feng Xunjian walked towards him, carrying a large bag, and placed her palms on her hips, spreading her elbows to the sides. Her face expressed dissatisfaction. She said loudly that 5 people wrote her 20 or 30 letters each. She asked Blind Bei how long it would take her to read them all, and what did she do to deserve it. Blind Bei smiled and hoped that Feng Xunjian would write back to them. He added that since they would not be there, she would be able to write something good to them. Feng Xingyang threw the bag on the floor and several letters fell out of it. With an angry expression on her face, she told Blind Bei to get lost and asked why that men could afford to go somewhere to have fun while she was forced to stay here alone. She also asked if Blind Bei really still wants her to write something good to them. Who does he take her for? Blind Bei smiled and made the analogy that he was holding her by a strong and powerful battery, which was strong enough to replace 6 ordinary batteries. Feng Xunjian bared her teeth in irritation. Night of the same day, Feng Xingyan gave a massage to Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan turned to her, said that he thought that the massage would be enough for today, and added that he wanted to rest. Feng Xunjian refused his idea with a smile and said that she wanted to sleep in the same bed as him. She added that the rest of the Demon Kings were not here right now, so she couldn't leave him for a second. Zhen Fan lay with his eyes closed, and a bead of sweat appeared on his face. Feng Xunjian said with enthusiasm that if Blind Bei was here with his radar, she wouldn't have to worry about Zhen Fan's safety. But since Blind Bei is absent, she does not have such techniques. Zhen Fan sat down and, turning to her, raised an eyebrow and asked if this was a burden for her. Feng Xunjian raised her bent index fingers to her eyes, pretending to wipe away her tears, and asked the master, does he really want her to sleep on the floor? She opened her eyes and looked at him, asking if he really hated her that much. Zhen Fan blushed, scratched his nose, and looked away, saying that this is not what he meant and he should stop being so sensitive. He added that he agreed with her and let them sleep together because he didn't mind. Feng Xunjian's face immediately became happy, and she said that in that case, she would go to her room and change clothes. She asked if Zhen Fan had any preferences. Finally, she added that she would bring several outfits so that he would have plenty to choose from. Zhen Fan agreed with her with reddened cheeks. When she happily ran out of the room, he frowned slightly and thought, do they really think that he is some kind of stone without needs? Such daily massages greatly excite him, and lately he has been training his Kai and blood, so. Before he could finish his thought, Mo Wang, imprisoned in stone and lying next to Zhen Fan, began to vibrate. Zhen Fan began to have a severe headache. He grabbed his head and wanted to ask what was happening, but his eyes rolled back and he fell face down into the bed. Feng Xunjian walked in with a flushed face, wearing one of her beautiful outfits, and told the master that she had returned. Afterwards, she mentally addressed her little Mo Wan, saying that perhaps when he wakes up, he will call her his mother. Feng Xunjiang was very surprised to see many purple pieces of parchment falling on her. In confusion, she mentally asked why her clothes turned into paper. These pieces of paper began to fly throughout the room, surrounding Feng Xingyang, and then they all flew in one direction. There was a loud explosion. Feng Xunjian coughed, opened one eye slightly, and saw a huge clawed hand. That clawed hand grabbed Feng Xingyang. Mo Wang emitted all this purple magic. Feng Xunjian was very surprised that it was Mo Wan, and he asked what she wanted him to call her. The next morning, Zhen Fan was lying in his bed and was awakened by the sun's rays. He sat down on the bed and looked around. Zhen Fan noticed Feng Xingyang sleeping on the floor. He was surprised to think, hadn't they agreed to sleep in the same bed? The rays of the morning sun also woke up Feng Xingyang. She stretched, asking if the gentleman had woken up yet. She added that his servant would wait until he washed his face. Zhen Fan agreed with her and with a dejected face thought that this was what was to be expected, because he was just another man whom she decided to tease. After Zhen Fan washed his face, Feng Xingyan helped him change clothes and added that breakfast was already ready. She asked him to go ahead, because his servant also needed to get himself in order. Zhen Fan was dressed in a black and red suit with gold accents. He agreed with her and began to leave the room, but suddenly noticed that Mo Wan was lying on a table nearby. Zhen Fan asked himself, didn't he leave it on the bed? And then I thought that Feng Xingyang probably removed it. Zhen Fan took it in his hands and left the room. Feng Xunjian looked after him with a sad look and said that she thought that something would work out between her and the master, but who would have thought that Mo Wan would stand in her way? She rhetorically asked Mo Wan whether he loved his father so much, or, on the contrary, hated him. She began to undress, continuing her monologue that if Mo Wan loves him, it means that he does not want a stepmother, and if he hates him, it means that Mo Wan will not allow him to touch the woman. She added that it must be difficult to be a father to Mo Wan. Feng Xunjian added dejectedly that it is difficult to be ambitious in old age, but he is a lucky person, and how difficult it is to become a stepmother. A conversation took place in the inn. One of the guests said that he heard that last night someone destroyed and captured the fort of the Mei family, located outside the city. His interlocutor asked how they dared to do something like that right under the nose of the Zhenbei army. He added that aren't they afraid that they will simply be cleared out? The third guest intervened, laughing, and said that after the Mei family's forces were defeated, the flag of the Zhenbei army was hung on the wall. Zhen Fan, holding a cup of drink in his hands, listened to their conversation and thought that, if his memory serves him correctly, the Mei family had a rather weak army. In addition, their fort is located halfway to the cities of Huchuo and Tumen. But due to the fact that they enjoyed the support of both cities, most of the troops did not dare to approach them. Zhen Fan sat relatively close to the talking guests. They continued to talk about how the Marquis of Zhenbei has been under severe oppression for the past few years. Doesn't he have enough problems? Another guest answered with a worried look that, if his memory served him correctly, the leader of the army was a lieutenant with the surname Zhen. The third guest asked, did the head of the district really order him to do this? And who was at the head of that team? Two of the guests laughed when they heard the surname Zhen. One of them explained that they also had a captain with the surname Gen. Another guest asked if it was their captain who went on a night raid and destroyed the Mei family. The third guest thought for a moment and said that the man held the rank of lieutenant in the Zhenbei army and led soldiers. It appears that their captain is also a lieutenant. Zhen Fan choked on his drink after hearing these words. All three guests turned to him. He pretended that everything was fine and thought about all of the above, not believing that this was their doing. One of these guests approached him and, addressing him with a smile as Lieutenant Zhen, asked if he could tell him what his official title was. The man bowed, and Zhen Fan replied with an indifferent face that he belonged to the Zhenbei army located in Huchuo City. Frowning, Zhen Fan looked at this guest and added that he was the captain of the merchant guards. This surprised the guests, and he, addressing Zhen Fan as the elder brother Zhen, asked to be allowed to ask a question: what are the intentions of the Zhenbei army? Zhen Fan began to get up from his seat, thinking that he himself did not know what the army's intentions were, and did not know what they had been doing since the moment they left the inn. Zhen Fan exhaled heavily and began to leave, and with a gloomy look asked, why would he explain the plans of the Marquis of Zhenbei to anyone? Sometime later, Wenju slammed the table loudly. He shouted at Zhen Fan, saying that the Marquis of Zhenbei was showing too much self-confidence. Wenju was furious and asked, what crime did the Mei family commit? Zhen Fan, with a calm face and slightly furrowed eyebrows, replied that most of their actions could be considered crimes. Wenju was even more angry with these words and, throwing one of the notebooks lying on the table at Zhen Fan, shouted that this is just a guess, and this is the city of Huchuo, and this is his trial. Wenju asked loudly, does Zhen Fan really think that he will not punish him for such impudence in his presence? The book hit Zhen Fan's face and began to fall, and he said that he had no comments, thinking that now all the problems fell on his shoulders, and only he himself did not know what was happening. Zhen Fan mentally wondered what he could do other than continue this performance. Wenju took out his katana from its sheath and swung to cut off Zhen Fan's head. Zhen Fan opened his eyes wide and wondered if he just felt a chill or was it a killing desire. He felt Mo Wan's activity appear under his clothes. His green kai materialized his true form. Zhen Fan was very surprised to see a huge spiky baby with an angry face. And Zhen Fan thought, has Mo Wan really woken up? Mo Wang is an unaccepted child with 9 lives. In each of his lives, his parents disowned him immediately after his birth. The anger that lurks inside Mo Wan is so great that it is enough to cleanse this world with blood. If Blind Bei and Feng Xingyin can be called adopted children for Zhen Fan, because their manhuas were works on which he was working when his partner left, then Mo Wang is his own son, because he created it from beginning to end. And now everything has come to the point that his own son threatens Zhen Fan's position. Wenju stopped the blade right in front of Zhen Fan's neck and then threw it to the floor. Wenju, with a serious face, put his hand on Zhen Fan's shoulder and asked why he was at home. Zhen Fan, not understanding what was happening, looked at Wenju. Mo Wan also hesitated. Zhen Fan, looking away, replied that the young lady was fine. And then I thought that it seemed that Mo Wang had calmed down after Wenju lowered his tone. Wenju continued to speak, calling Zhen Fan brother, that just recently he happened to pass through the gates of hell. He added, wiping tears from his cheeks, that, unfortunately, the young lady also had a hard time. Wenju said that His Excellency had to go to the capital, and therefore the Marquis's family could only count on the help of the young lady. Zhen Fan thought that it seemed like Wenju was a spy for the Zhenbei army. Also, Zhen Fan never thought that he would get to be a part of a spy film. Wenju said that he remembered that Zhen Fan's family moved to Huchuo City about 6 months ago. He asked if they had come here on behalf of the young lady. Zhen Fan suggested that it might be possible to find out some information from Wenju. Zhen Fan said with a serious face that the lady saved his life, and his father and his grandfather were servants of the Lai family. He added that his father's name is Zhen Chenggong, and his grandfather's name is Zhen Zhilong. Zhen Fan asked Wenju if he knew them. Wenju became a little nervous, smiled, and, after hesitating a little, said that he had heard about them, and besides, in his opinion, they once drank with Zhen Fan's father. Wenju asked, does it really follow from all this that integration into the ranks of the underground gangs of Huchuo City is also an order from the madam? Zhen Fan responded positively and said that this is only the first step. Wenju immediately covered his mouth with his hand and, frowning, looked back, raising the index finger of his other hand up. Wenju ordered him to remain silent and asked how Zhen Fan dared to say such things to a stranger like himself, and added that Zhen Fan should not be so gullible next time. Zhen Fan opened his eyes wide, surprised by his actions, and then said that Wenju was right. Wenju slapped his hand on his chest and said with a serious look that he would take care of the Mei family's fortress, and if Zhen Fan had any problems in the future, he could immediately turn to Wenju, and if one day the lady wanted to get all the Huchuo, then let Zhen Fan just say it. Zhen Fan looked at him carefully, and he himself thanked the writers of spy films, because without them he would not have known what to do. Wenju, filled with determination, said that he, Wenju, would personally open the gates to the lady and offer her this city. Zhen Fan thought with an indifferent face that today's barrier had been successfully passed. A few days later it was deep night. Zhen Fan was relaxing in the hot spring. Feng Xunjian, sitting next to him, announced that the mail had arrived. Zhen Fan explained with a dejected look that the Demon Kings had indeed sent him letters. Feng Xunjian handed him the parchment, and he took it, saying that only the letters from Blind Bay were useful. Shaking the piece of paper in his hand, Zhen Fan asked with a dejected look, why did he have the feeling that the Mei family fortress might attack them first? In that case, it would be better if they attacked this fortress themselves, and Zhen Fan must be an ally of the Zhenbei army to deal with the reports of Huchuo City. Precisely because if it weren't for the fact that Zhen Fan is the highest official of the city and also a spy for the Marquis of the Zhenbei army, he would have been dead long ago. Feng Xunjian sat down next to him, placing his head on her lap, and said that he was probably tired from this daily training. She asked when he thought he would be able to get his rank. Feng Xunjian smiled and kneaded his scalp with gentle movements of her fingers. Zhen Fan smiled with pleasure and explained that Dingru said that in order to completely control blood and Kai, sometimes all that is needed is chance. Zhen Fan added that he does not know, and perhaps when he opens his eyes tomorrow, he will already have this rank. Feng Xunjian continued to massage his head and said that she knew that there was a hole in his heart. He laughed and said that it was not so, opening his eyes slightly. Above him was a blushing Feng Xunjian, and her breasts were too close to his face. She said that in her opinion, this gap is right in front of his eyes. Zhen Fan was shocked by what he saw and immediately jumped up, taking Mo Wan's stone. Zhen Fan blushed and said that he was tired and needed to rest. He stood up and climbed out of the hot spring, starting to walk away. Feng Xingyang, still sitting on the ground, said that she remembers that Mo Wang is a spirit who needs the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and it seems to her that he can easily replenish his strength if Zhen Fan puts him somewhere for the night. Courtyard so that he could absorb the moon essence. Zhen Fan, standing in a robe, turned to her and asked if she thought this would work. Feng Xunjian walked up to him with a worried look and asked him to at least once listen to what the others were telling him. She added that even if a thief breaks in here, who would think of stealing a broken stone? Zhen Fan looked thoughtfully at the stone belonging to Mo Wan and put it on a table on the street, saying that it was worth a try. Mo Wan began to exude Kai energy, but Zhen Fan and Feng Xinyan no longer saw this. They went into the room. Finally, Zhen Fan asked, "Has the wind gotten stronger?" Feng Xunjian guessed that it was the north wind, and then said that it didn't matter, because it was the norm here. Feng Xinyan suggested that Zhen Fan be undressed first, and at that moment Mo Wang appeared from the stone. He was very angry about what had happened. Feng Xinyan helps Zhen Fan undress, mentally repeating the name Mo Wang. She didn't know why Mo Wan was afraid to appear in front of the master, but since he continued to avoid him, she didn't believe that Mo Wan would dare to rush in here. Besides, how could she let go of the man she wanted? Feng Xunjian thought that the creators of her and the other demon kings had not done anything wrong for Mo Wan, but he still wanted to protect his father from getting involved with other women. Feng Xinyan hugged Zhen Fan from behind and watched his face. He immediately blushed, pronouncing her name in surprise. Feng Xingyang stood on her tiptoes and approached Zhen Fan's ear, whispering that he had several bruises on his chest, and she would help him get rid of them. Zhen Fan closed his eyes and blushed. He said he didn't want her to do that. Feng Xunjian pressed her fingers on his chest, asking if he didn't trust her. Zhen Fan replied that this was not the case. Feng Xunjian said with confidence that his blood was still congested, and it needed to be dealt with as quickly as possible. Zhen Fan accepted her arguments and asked her to try harder in this case. Feng Xunjiang blushed slightly and asked him to let his servant remove this tension with his hands. Zhen Fan agreed, having no choice. The next morning, he woke up to the rays of the sun and stretched. Zhen Fan was very surprised when he felt his Kai energy, and, not believing his feelings, asked if he had really received a rank. Tumen City is a point of commercial exchange between the Dayan region and the western regions. Blind Bay, playing a pleasant melody on the piano, said that initially they only wanted to talk about soap and perfume. Blind Bay was sitting at the piano when a merchant from the western region, whose name was Wen Ti, was sitting on a chair in the same room. Zhu San stood behind the back of his chair and threatened him, holding a blade next to Wen Ti's throat. Wen Ti was very scared. Blind Bay continued to talk to him, saying that he asked them to change their methods, but before he could finish his sentence, several men in armor and carrying swords burst into the room. They ran towards Blind Bay with the intention of attacking him. And Blind Bay at that moment finished his sentence by saying that people can be very cheap. He directed his Kai energy at these men, and they flew back. Blind Bay continued to say that both the perfume and the soap were already ready, and to be honest, they could even give them the secret recipe before anyone else knew the ingredients. They could easily make a huge amount of money. Blind Bay turned to Wen Ti again and added that in exchange for this, they only ask for some silver, 600 high-class horses, and 300 sets of armor and weapons. Blind Bay explained that they needed all this to imitate the equipment of the Zhenbei army, and Blind Bay was confident that Wen Ti would be able to get something similar. Blind Bay asked what Wen Ti thought about this. Wen Ti forced a smile and said that he just wanted to know why until today they hid their location after bringing him soap and perfume. Blind Bay replied with a smile that they were waiting for the money to appear. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan's training was taking place in the pavilion of the inn. He stood in a stance with his eyes closed and exuded black Kai energy after a night of circulating blood. Dingru was very surprised that the Kai belonging to Zhen Fan was black. Zhen Fan opened his eyes and, turning to Dingru, asked, "Is this really some kind of special type?" Dingru, a little worried, replied that it was actually a fairly common variety. Zhen Fan, slightly angry, asked why Dingru was so surprised. Dingru asked with a smile if he was joking. Dingru explained that since Zhen Fan had reached his rank, it meant that the teacher's career had come to an end. He added that their relationship can no longer be characterized as that of teacher and student. Dingru asked in his mind, "Does Zhen Fan really not understand why this is so surprising?" Zhen Fan closed his eyes and calmly said that he would have completely forgotten about it if Dingru had not reminded him. Zhen Fan turned to Feng Xingyang with an indifferent face, saying that this person was no longer useful, and she could use him as plant fertilizer. Dingzhu was shocked by his words and wanted to object, thinking that, having agreed to be a teacher for a while, he had become one for the rest of his life. Zhen Fan laughed, patted Dingru on the shoulder, and said that he was joking. Feng Xinyan entered the room and addressed Dingru, saying that their master was the most attentive and kind person. She walked up to Dingru and crossed her arms under her chest, as she said arrogantly that Dingru had two choices of being used as fertilizer or joining their ranks as their lackey. She said the last word hesitantly, and Zhen Fan cleared his throat with a smile and corrected her, saying that she wanted to say about the servant, and not about the lackey. Feng Xinyan approached Zhen Fan and, blushing, hugged his arm. She said she thought footmen sounded more authoritative. Zhen Fan also blushed and agreed with her, saying that let it be as she wants. Zhen Fan looked at her with a smile and thought that beautiful women are beautiful, but at the same time they are dangerous. Feng Xinyan turned to Dingru and asked, "What does he choose?" Dingru lowered his head and said with a sad look that even if he became a lackey in their family, he would still be of no use. He asked what good would it do, except that they would just waste their food on it. Feng Xingyang said that he didn't have to worry about it. She explained that the Zhen family's dogs are different from other families' dogs. For example, if someone's dog breaks its paw, it will most likely be allowed in for soup. Feng Xingyang smiled resolutely. using her Kai energy, and said that despite this, the Zhen family will always help their dog get his paw back. Dingzhu was very surprised at her words and shouted, "Can he really be cured?" Feng Sunjian explained to him that she would not have been able to do this before, but now she is truly capable of this. Dingru fell out of the wheelchair, bowing with his face down to the floor. He shouted that he agreed and called Zhen Fan Master 3 times. Zhen Fan turned around and began to leave, saying that after the treatment, Dingru could calmly get to work. After that, he added that Feng Xingyang could start treatment. She bowed and said that it would be done. Later, Zhen Fan sat in the hall and sipped a drink from a cup. Feng Xinyan entered the room. She approached him and said that she wanted to inform him that Dingzhu would need several days to fully recover. She also thinks that he will be able to return to the 9th level of martial artist. Zhen Fan, with a calm face, replied that he remembered that she said that she was not able to heal him. Feng Xunzhong hesitated for a moment, a bead of sweat running down her face. She said that she had been practicing a little lately, and it seemed like she was able to get her basic skills back. She thought that Blind Bay is not here now, and she doesn't know whether to tell the master about her restoration. Feng Xingyan rushed into Zhen Fan's arms. They both blushed. She told the master that she wanted to continue her training tonight so that her arms could regain their full strength. She added that she must work with all her might for the benefit of her master, so she asked him not to refuse this request. Zhen Fan was very surprised and embarrassed. He agreed unconditionally. One of the servants called out to him. The servant bowed and calmly announced that someone from Yemen had come to the lobby and was asking for the master. Zhen Fan was embarrassed, and he replied that he would come now. A man dressed in blue was sitting in the lobby. He approached Officer Zhen, saying that he had a beautiful house. The man added that he was sure that Zhen Fan spent a lot of money on him. Zhen Fan, sitting down next to the man, answered in the negative, explaining that there were rumors that there were ghosts in this house, so this house was quite cheap. The man took a cup of tea and, smiling broadly, said that the day after tomorrow they were going to send a batch of birthday gifts to the Markwise, and the man's master wanted Zhen Fan to accompany this process. Zhen Fan asked about birthday gifts. The man became gloomy and asked, "Has Zhen Fan forgotten that Lady Markwise Zhenbei's 50th birthday will be held in a few days?" Zhen Fan said with a serious look that he would not forget the kindness that the lady showed to his family. Zhen Fan mentally explained that he simply did not know about this fact, but fortunately, he reacted quickly enough. Zhen Fan asked with a smile. After all, they could ask anyone for this service. Why go to him? He thought that sending birthday gifts was not a difficult task, but did Zhu Wen really have something else to ask? The man in blue brought his palm to his face, beginning to speak more quietly about the fact that there was actually something else. Tomorrow, his master is going to leave Huchuo City and go to patrol the border. But in fact, he plans to mix with the escort and get to the residence of the Marquis of Zhendai. Zhen Fan was very surprised by these words, but he was even more surprised when the man said that the gentleman believed that thanks to Zhen Fan's connections, he could secretly meet with the lady and the princess. That evening, Zhen Fan sat in the office at the table and reasoned while Feng Xingyang massaged his head with a smile. Zhen Fan said that birthday gifts are another problem. If anyone finds out about their mission, Zhu Wenju will be furious, and they will only have to save their lives. Feng Xingyang asked the gentleman, "Why don't they just steal these gifts?" She suggested murder and added with a smile that they could also create sabotage when the time came. Zhen Fan agreed with her, opening his eyes, and said that since Zhu Wenju wanted to hide his identity and blend in with his surroundings, this would be their best chance. He added that they will recruit, and this recruitment will be effective. It's too early to give up. He rested his head on his hand and said that on the day of departure, Feng Xingyang would disguise someone to accompany Zhen Fan, and then she would put on a show on the road. He added that tomorrow he would ask the soldiers who would be accompanying them to come out and give them a good shake. Feng Xunjian agreed with him with a bright smile. Feng Xunjian walked around him and sat on one of his knees, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. She asked seductively if he could help her with her sewing. Zhen Fan blushed and looked at her in surprise, and Feng Xingyang said that she lacked practice and found it difficult to handle the needle. She pressed her chest against Zhen Fan. A little while later, during lunch, Soldiers came to Zhen Fan. They loudly wished him health, kneeling down to the bottom and bowing. Zhen Fan explained that he was only the Marquis's lackey and was not worthy of being part of the birthday gift accompaniment. Zhen Fan added with a serious look that if his mistress found out about this, she would punish him and say that he had behaved extremely stupidly. The soldiers became nervous because of his words, thinking that he and the princess were very close to each other. Zhen Fan continued to talk about how he is a straightforward person, but he will always remember the words of the Marquis that he needs to lead the army, drink wine with the soldiers and deal with matters and enjoy his achievements. Ding Ru, who was standing next to him, smiled. He was undercover. He had his hair tied in a ponytail and was wearing expensive blue clothes. Zhen Fan continued to say, addressing the soldiers as brothers, that he thought that each of them knew what was going to happen tomorrow. And since things had taken this turn, when the time came, he would count on their full support, and since he will treat them with sincerity, he will certainly recommend them to his mistress. With an arrogant look, Zhen Fan loudly added that they would become rich together in the future. All the soldiers bowed and shouted loudly that they were at his service. Zhen Fan calmly thanked them and drank from the bowl, closing his eyes. He thought that these officials came from small families and were nevertheless quite wise, but unfortunately, rank was quite difficult to obtain, and he could not demonstrate it to them. Someone behind the door shouted loudly and swore. Zhen Fan frowned and mentally asked, "Who dares to spoil such a moment?" He quickly walked to the doors and opened them with a kick. In front of them was a man in a green robe. He held the tear-stained girl who was lying under him by the chest. Her clothes were wrinkled, and the girl herself was almost naked. The man was the chief official of Huchuo City. He looked in surprise towards the open door. Ding Ru shouted the girl's name in surprise, Zayakui. Zhen Fan turned around and asked if Ding Ru knew this woman. The chief official rose to his feet and asked furiously who they were and whether they knew who he was. Meanwhile, the girl covered her eyes with her hands and sobbed loudly. Ding Ru replied that this was his brother Wang Lai's wife. Zhen Fan mentally cursed and asked himself, could this really be the same woman that Blind Bei helped? Zhen Fan turned to Ding Ru and asked if he was angry that this official tried to rape her. Ding Ru said that he was angry. Zhen Fan asked why then he doesn't do anything. Ding Ru said, gritting his teeth, that this person is the top official of Huchuo City. Zhen Fan asked firmly and loudly, who is Ding Ru himself now? Zhen Fan thought about how he didn't know if Blind Bei was telling the truth about how he didn't do anything to her, but if he was lying, that means she was half his woman. Ding Ru, not understanding Zhen Fan's behavior, replied that he was now a servant. Zhen Fan objected that this is not so, and now he is his dog, and his dogs don't just tolerate insults. Zhen Fan added that if his dog wants to bite someone, then let him do it. Zhen Fan ensured that he would be responsible for the death of this official. Ding Ru strongly agreed with him. Frowning, he took a step towards the official. The official pointed his finger at Ding Ru angrily and shouted, why doesn't he leave? He asked with rage and fear, did Ding Ru really not know who he really was? Ding Ru grabbed the official's finger with which he was pointing and broke it. There was a crunch, after which the official screamed heart-rendingly in pain. Ding Zhu kicked the official in the face and then began beating him. Meanwhile, Zhen Fan walked up to Zayakui and asked what happened. She replied that the official said that the authorities were going to try her late husband and she should see the official here. Zhen Fan noticed that her breasts were not real, and they were pads. Zayakui, wiping tears from her eyes, continued to say plaintively that if she had not met with this official, her entire family would have been involved in this matter. Zhen Fan stood up and left the room. He became gloomy, reasoning that there was at least one woman in this world who knew about such things. Zhen Fan mentally cursed at Blind Bei. He decided that he believed him, and then loudly ordered Ding Zhu to bring the official to him. Ding Zhu obeyed the order and, taking the clothes, brought the beaten official to Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan thought that if he did not deal with this matter radically, decisively and bloodily, he might have problems with Blind Bei. Zhen Fan realized that he didn't even want to feel the feeling of arguing with Blind Bei. Zhen Fan gave the order to gather people, because he will need them. He touched this official's cheek and decided that this man should die. One of the soldiers asked Captain Zhen what he needed soldiers for. Zhen Fan replied with a terrifying look that he was going to destroy the entire family of this official. After some time, a whole army of soldiers was gathered near the house of this official's family. A crowd of people also gathered on the street. Someone said that the Chen family used to be in charge here, but this person never thought that this day would come. One of the soldiers said that when he thinks about the future in which he dies in battle, he thinks about the orphans and widows who will be abused by this Chen family. This soldier added that he wanted to destroy their entire family. Someone agreed with this statement and added that if the soldiers want to ensure that their families are not in danger in the future, this time they simply cannot let the Chen family leave. Zhen Fan led this army while sitting on a horse. He remembered the words of Blind Bei, who said that in order to determine his position in society, Zhen Fan must maintain a high status. Zhen Fan thought that as long as he maintained a high status, no one would dare to joke with him or spy on him. And if he gives up, problems will continue to appear. And why in all dramas do enemies die with one blow? But he himself is not even able to destroy the door. Zhen Fan, a little nervous, thought about this, and then one of the soldiers asked why his lordship did not give an order. Another soldier shouted that they must hurry, and the longer they wait, the more exhausted people there will be inside this Chen family's house. Another soldier said that this is true, and they cannot give them such pleasure. They are not worthy of it. Zhen Fan decided that he had a responsibility to protect himself and the family property that he and Blind Bei had worked so hard for. Zhen Fan raised his hand with a serious look and began to give an order, but someone stopped him. It was Zuyi Wenju riding a wonderful beast. Like Kaiyan had the same animal only with a different color. Zhu Wenju angrily shouted that Zhen Fan was going with him, and Zhu Wenju personally found out from him what exactly prompted him to such actions. He continued to shout, asking if Zhen Fan knew that mobilizing troops or gathering a crowd for an uprising was a serious crime. State troops and troops belonging to Zhen Fan gathered on the street. The state army soldiers loudly told Zhen Fan that they were forced to ask him to surrender his weapons. Zhen Fan frowned, thinking, and then used Kai energy. Everyone was mentally surprised that he was level 9 at such a young age, and thought that besides him, only the Marquis of the Zhenbei family had achieved this. The army belonging to Zhen Fan began to make noise, praising their captain. Zhen Fan entered the gate of the house, thinking that Zhu Wenju was furious with today's commotion. But in the end, no matter what status Zhen Fan had, Zhu Wenju could not allow something like this to happen in Huchuo City. Zuyi Wenju blocked the way. He grabbed Zhen Fan's shoulder when they were alone in the building and praised him for his good job. Zhen Fan was mentally very surprised by such a reaction. Zuyi Wenju turned around and explained with a smile that now that the situation has become complicated and the Marquis has settled in the capital, they must always be prepared, and if they take advantage of the Chen family to unite their soldiers in hatred of a common enemy, they can boost their morale, so they can get double the result with only half the effort. Zhu Wenju praised Zhen Fan for his good work, calling him a good son. Zhen Fan was completely perplexed. Zuyi Wenju happily began to leave, saying that Zhen Fan could continue what he was doing with confidence. Zhu Wenju added that he heard that Zhen Fan would be in charge of escorting the birthday gifts. Zuyi Wenju asked to let the old county magistrate do the finishing touches. He turned around, waved his hand, and said with a smile that tomorrow he would join them when they left the city, because it seemed to him that if the soldiers decided to commit some kind of heinous act, real chaos would begin there. Therefore, Zuyi Wenju decided to go with them. He added that he wanted to make sure whether Huchuo City was still Great Yan's domain or not. Zhen Fan, being shocked by everything that happened, thought that Zhu Wenju had a very rich imagination and would make an excellent artist for a manhua. The blue-robed man who recently visited Zhen Fan said with a smile that his master has very poor sense of direction. So this man hopes that Zhen Fan will take care of him. Zhen Fan was all sweaty, smiled excitedly, and agreed with him. The blue-robed man raised his hand and immediately ordered everyone to kill the Chen family. Zhen Fan mentally noted how ruthless this was. All the warriors rushed to the attack shouting, "Kill!" Sometime later, on the night of the same day, the Chen family's house was destroyed, and Zhen Fan was sitting on some rubble. He asked Dingru if he wanted to know what he was doing here in the middle of the night. Dingzhu asked, "Is it really all about the unpleasant feeling after what happened?" Zhen Fan smoked a cigarette and said with a depressed look that he himself didn't know. He explained that he just wanted to come here. Zhen Fan lit a new cigarette. Ding Ru, a little nervous, told him that he could share his true feelings with him. Zhen Fan set the condition that if he wants Zhen Fan to reveal his true feelings to him, then he must call him his younger brother. Ding Ru was a little shocked by this statement. Nervous, he addressed Zhen Fan as a younger brother and said that to be honest. At first he seemed like an extremely cold-blooded person, but sometimes he thinks that Zhen Fan is quite humane, and sometimes he himself has a very difficult time understanding him. Zhen Fan, frowning slightly, said that this sounds too pretentious, and Ding Ru is like those scientists. Zhen Fan explained that his life in this life is too comfortable, so he can also call himself pretentious. He never faced hunger, never suffered, because when he woke up, everything was already ready for him. But in the future, he simply cannot afford to be pretentious. Zhen Fan said this while exhaling smoke. He thought about what they say that during the day the horrors of war manifest themselves in revenge. But these soldiers still managed to acquire some wealth for themselves and enjoy this life. His old world was also a warm and fuzzy place that also had cannibalism. But this world is 1,000,000 times bloodier. Zhen Fan lowered his head and said that he could no longer afford to be a burden. Feng Xingyang carefully put a red outerwear on Zhen Fan. She took him by the shoulders and asked if he would mind if she kept him company. Dingju, meanwhile, decided to leave them so as not to create awkward moments. Zhen Fan turned his head to Feng Xingyang and said that she shouldn't do this, and she can go back and pack her things, because tomorrow they will leave this place. Feng Xunjian bowed to him and obeyed the order with a smile. Zhen Fan stood up and said that he was a little tired today and decided to go lie down. Feng Xunjian blushed and enthusiastically said that it was still quite early, and they could play cards or dice when they got home. She added that she would make an excellent dealer. In the evening, a day after the gifts began, a tent camp was organized in the forest. It was late evening. Zhen Fan stood near one of the carts with a huge load hidden under a cloth and asked, "Is this a gift from the Zhu family fortress for the wife of the Marquis?" Ding Ru stood behind him and bowed and said that this is a rare beast, which is a red wolf. Zhen Fan turned to him with a serious face, said that he understood him, and Ding Ru could go. He immediately obeyed. Zhen Fan moved the cloth aside and, upon entering, noticed Ziyu Wenju sitting next to the wolf's cage and eating chicken. He was very surprised when he noticed Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan smiled and nodded at him. Ziyu Wenju asked how did Zhen Fan know that he was here. Zhen Fan came in and sat down next to him, asking where else could he be with such a physique. Zhen Fan thanked him with a smile for hiding. Ziyu Wenju said with a smile that he had been a beast for most of his life, so it was natural for him to only be around this wolf. Zhen Fan noticed that someone else was entering here. It was a man in simple clothes with disheveled hair. He walked into the room and also sat down on a chair. Ziyu Wenju handed him a chicken leg. Zhen Fan thought that Zhu Wenju really brought a guard with him, and this is a problem. After they finished eating the chicken, all that was left was the bones. The guard left, and Zhen Fan asked my lord if she should ask him to cook more food. Zhu Wenju patted his stomach with a smile and said that there was no need to do this, because he was already full. Zhen Fan pointed his finger towards the guard and explained with a smile that he meant that person. Zhen Fan said that he didn't think he had eaten half of the fried chicken. Ziyu Wenju asked in surprise, "Isn't this person one of Zhen Fan's people?" They were both in great shock. A little while later, Zhen Fan covered his face with his hand and asked himself what he was trying to do, struggling with the air for half a day. Sometime later, passing by another tent, Zhen Fan thought that after 200 searches, he still could not find that man. Zhen Fan decided that he could not fight Ziyu Wenju until he knew his opponent. And suddenly Zhen Fan saw in front of him the man who had entered their cart earlier. This man sat in front of the fire on which food was being cooked and ate. Zhen Fan immediately thought of Feng Xingyang. She jumped out from behind the tent. Feng Xingyang was wearing soldier's armor. She frowned and looked at Zhen Fan. Zhen Fan looked at her in surprise and thought that fortunately she was fine. But does she really mean that this man is so strong that he can escape? Zhen Fan sat next to the man and said that this was wrong. He asked the man how he could eat a Chinese samovar without sauce. Zhen Fan turned to Feng Xingyang and asked her to bring a plate of sauce. When Feng Xingyan came with the sauce and sat down with them, Zhen Fan was eating and thinking about how it infuriates him when the protagonist has to flatter the boss. Zhen Fan thought that in the worst-case scenario, next year Blind Bay would light incense and remove the grass from his grave. Zhen Fan, holding a piece of food with chopsticks, showed this unkempt man that he should dip the piece of food into the sauce. The man smiled. Zhen Fan asked Feng Xingyang to serve him his sauce. She agreed and fulfilled his request. Zhen Fan politely talked to the man while he was eating with a smile. Zhen Fan said that now they are on the road and there is nothing to do. But when the work is over, this man can follow him. Zhen Fan promised that this man would receive good food and drink all year round, different every day. This man stopped eating and with an ominous face, smiling, asked, "Can Zhen Fan promise him anything?" Zhen Fan responded positively, saying that if he has it, he will give it away. The man pointed his finger at Feng Xingyang. He said that he wants her because she is good. Feng Xingyang was very surprised, and Zhen Fan looked up at her. Zhen Fan smirked and told the man to draw his sword. Closing his eyes, he thought that everything happened as he expected. Feng Xunjian couldn't hide her true appearance from this man, but she's not for sale. Zhen Fan thought that he had already died once, and his main goal in this world was to do things. Feng Xunjiang prepared to attack using her Kai energy. Zhen Fan mentally asked, should he really sacrifice his woman to make this world a better place? Why would he do this? The man continued to say that she was very good, and he was also very good. This man pointed his finger at Zhen Fan's chest, where Yeager was lying. Zhen Fan was very surprised, and, looking at his chest, thought that this man felt Yeager's presence. Igor used magic and moved into Zhen Fan's body. He said that this man can see him, and Yeager cannot let him go. He must be killed. He must be eaten. Feng Xingyan looked worriedly at Zhen Fan's body, which was controlled by Yeager. She was very surprised to realize this. The man they were talking to, who was very gloomy and with a very serious face, said that in front of them was the god of the barbarians. This man very quickly struck Feng Xingyang and Zhen Fan several times, causing them to fall to the ground. Zhen Fan mentally cursed and said that this man is from a barbarian tribe and he is very strong. Zhen Fan began to guess what level he was, 7th or 6th, or perhaps even stronger. This man was picking his teeth with his finger with a smile. He said indifferently that Zhen Fan's food is very tasty, and he understands. The barbarian god continued to say that in the past he might have agreed to this proposal, but unfortunately, now he has little time. The barbarian god lay down on the ground and said with a wide smile that Zhen Fan is not bad, but he is different from those two, and he could prepare more food for the barbarian god, and in return he would be alive. Zhen Fan appreciated his generosity with irritation and sarcasm. The barbarian god with an ominous face said that before he died, he could help Zhen Fan kill the fat man in his carriage. Zhen Fan shouted with excitement that the barbarian god had misunderstood him, because Zuyi Wenju was his elder. The barbarian god lay on his back and threw his hands behind his head, saying that he felt that Zhen Fan wanted Zuyi Wenju dead. He added that he was full and was going to rest. He ordered Zhen Fan to prepare a tent for him. Zhen Fan stood up and said that there is no problem. But does the elder know this junior's forbidden name? Zhen Fan frowned and added that he would not ask if the barbarian god was uncomfortable, but the elder might regret it. The barbarian god turned away from Zhen Fan, placing his hand under his head. He said that the people of the Central Plains, say that a good man should not change his last name. The barbarian god introduced himself. His name is Shadow Queshy. Shadow Queshy asked the name of the young man he was talking to. Zhen Fan remembered the old man who was caught by Zhu San and AI. He thought that he had met a man from the Shadow Tribe again. Zhen Fan lied that his name was Fan Lai and bowed. He remembered how the soldiers addressed him as Commander Zhen. Zhen Fan thought that although they had temporarily stopped the barbarian tribe, could Fan Lai's name be hidden? Maybe he already knows that Zhen Fan killed the strongest warriors of the Shadow Queshy tribe. Had he infiltrated their escort just for food? Zhen Fan realized that they were not transporting gifts, but a whole time bomb. It was deep evening in the desert. Zhen Fan thought that he could turn around and leave, but he would not be able to meet the strongest of this world in battle. And yet, running away like this was contrary to his principles. Zhen Fan entered the carriage where Zhu Wenju was sitting, thinking that perhaps he had a bad feeling. Zhu Wenju was eating again. Zhen Fan stated that they should arrive tomorrow afternoon. He asked my lord to wait a little longer. Zhu Wenju, wiping his lips with a napkin and putting a piece of meat on a plate, asked, "Will he really be able to see her tomorrow night?" Zhen Fan looked at the piece of meat on the plate and thought that yesterday there was fried chicken. Today there was fried venison, and everything was just cooked. It seems that in this group, there are Zhu Wenju's people and those who can easily get the necessary provisions, which means that the other force is definitely not ordinary people. Zhen Fan answered Zhu Wenju's question positively and got off the carriage. Zhen Fan walked with a thoughtful look, putting his index finger to his chin, and thought that tomorrow they would reach the northern Marquia's estate, and then it would be difficult for him to hide his identity. The ominous voice of Shadow Queshy sounded behind him. He said that if Zhen Fan wants to kill, then let him kill. Zhen Fan was very scared and wanted to turn around, but Shadow Queshy stopped him by grabbing his shoulder with his hand. When he removed his hand, Zhen Fan still turned to him and, frowning, said that if he killed him, there would be problems. Zhen Fan saw that this Shadow Kyushi was fully equipped and asked if he was leaving. He responded positively and agreed to the request to accompany himself. Zhen Fan became nervous, thinking that he just wanted to be polite and not actually see him off. Sometime later, in the desert, 3 candles were burning on the ground. Next to them there was meat on a plate, and there was sand in the vessel. Shato Queshy said that the barbarians follow 3 rules, which are to praise the god of the barbarians, lay down a totem, and lay down yellow sand. Zhen Fan mentally asked, standing behind him, who is he even making offerings to? Zhen Fan exhaled, knelt down, and began to bow. Shadow Queshy asked him who he worshipped. Zhen Fan, rising from her knees, replied with a calm face that where he comes from, it doesn't matter what religion a person professes, he bows anyway. Zhen Fan explained that this is just a head movement and is not difficult to do. Shadow Queshy agreed with this statement and began to eat the meat from the plate. Zhen Fan became gloomy at this behavior and said that if he was hungry, he would have to wait, because they must finish the offering first. Shadow Queshy said that the one to whom the offering is made will not mind. Zhen Fan, starting to get a little nervous and frowned, asked who Shadow Queshy was making the offering to. He put the piece of meat back on the plate and firmly said that he was making the offering